This is the only source to such an offer and consequently rejection. If this really happened, it must have been sometime before the year 1671. Apart from Árni Magnússon's transcription of Torfæus's small list of manuscripts, there was no record of Flateyjarbók in the early part of this period. Thus, it doesn't appear in the two oldest catalogues of books in the Royal Library, assembled by the librarian Willem Worm in the years 1663 to 1670. The Danish scholar Erik Petersen, who has worked with these catalogues, observes that no Icelandic manuscripts are mentioned at all, and guesses that a reason for this could be that these manuscripts formed their own collection within the library. As mentioned, Flateyjarbók came back to the library from Norway in 1704, together with the other manuscripts from this collection, and they could therefore be registered by Thomas von Westen, who worked as an assistant at the library in the years 1707 to 1710. Von Westen's catalogue, Catalogus Manuscriptorum Icelandicorum in Regia Bibliotheca Occurrentium, is still extant, and it registers Flateyjarbók as the first manuscript in the Icelandic collection, together with a description of its contents. Further work with Flateyjarbók from these years resulted in a transcription of the whole manuscript for the private scholar P.F. Suhm, and a translation into Latin of the Flatey Annals. In 1778, J.H. Schlegel took over as director of the library from B. Møllmann, who had neglected many of his duties, probably due to him being half blind, and thus the whole collection was in disorder. Schlegel therefore demanded a revision of the library, and including the manuscripts, which revision resulted in a catalogue of the whole collection according to the location of the books in the library, as well as in a systematic way in the years 78 to 79. And finally, a Jacobus Georgius Christianus Adler, not known when, made a description of the contents of Flateyjarbók, which is now kept together with the mentioned catalogue by von Westen. The contents is described in 33 items. In all the mentioned catalogues, Flateyjarbók is referred to as codex in the singular. It is possible that a single codex could consist of several volumes. But when we consider the two catalogues by von Westen and by Adler, they don't refer to any such, and it would, as it seems, be a very obvious place to mention any division of the manuscript. And it can be added that in the letters between Torfæus and Árni Magnússon, and in the writings of Árni Magnússon, Flateyjarbók is always referred to as bók or codex, never in the plural. This, of course, isn't a positive proof that the manuscript was bound in a single volume at this point, but it is surely a circumstantial evidence pointing in this direction. There are, however, still two more bits of evidence to consider. In his large work on Copenhagen from 1748, Laurits de Thurah also describes the Royal Library and mentions 4 closed cupboards with glass doors in which are kept a rare treasure of manuscripts. The manuscripts include books on the history of the North, laws, and especially Icelandic and Norwegian manuscripts. The cupboards were placed in each end of the library in the gallery. For the interested reader, Thurah gives a more detailed description of Flateyjarbók. Among the most curious of the manuscripts is the so-called Codex Flateyjensis, containing a history of the kings of Norway, written in the ancient Norwegian or Icelandic tongue. It is called Codex Flateyjensis because it many years ago was found in the island of Flatey in Iceland. This book is an extreme rarity and is by the famous antiquarian Árna Magneu estimated to be of the value of many thousand riksdaler. And finally, the presumably Scottish James Johnston published a couple of editions with text from Flateyjarbók in 1780 and 1782, respectively. In the last of these, the Norwegian account of Hako's expedition against Scotland, the editor presents several texts from Flateyjarbók and Codex Frisianus with a parallel translation. In his introduction, he describes Flateyjarbók The Book of Flatey is a very large vellum volume in folio and appears to have been compiled in the 14th age. This venerable volume, the noblest treasure of northern literature now existing, though wrote in a very small character and much abbreviated, consists of 960 columns, 2 on each page. Tourist description adds further to our circumstantial evidence, and the introduction by Johnson seems to conclude the matter, at least insofar as could be expected when judging in a historical case. When Johnson saw Flateyjarbók, it was indeed a single, very large and venerable volume. The next question would then be, when did the rebinding in 2 volumes take place? In the catalogue by Jón Eiríksson of the manuscripts in the Royal Library, Flateyjarbók is described as Codex Flateyensis, in large folio in 2 volumes and with various, as we heard, notations by Torfæus. The work with the catalogue was ended on October the 30th, 1784, and thus we can date the rebinding to somewhere between 1782 and 1784. But we can get a little closer. Jón Eiríksson originally expected to conclude his work with the folio manuscript sometime in 1784, but already in a 1783 report on his work, he could tell his senior that the work with the folio manuscripts was concluded, and thus the rebinding must have happened between the years 1782 and 1783, or at least shortly after. The printed version of the catalogue, which appeared a few years later in 1786, also mentions 2 volumes. Unfortunately, a thorough search through the protocols over rebindings in the archives and the accounts of the library haven't given any results as to the exact date of the rebinding, though we can conclude with a great degree of certainty that it was done in connection with Jón Eiríksson's work with the collection for the catalogue. Conservator Mette Jakobsen, who participated in the preparing Flateyjarbók for the transfer to Iceland, described the binding thus. Flateyjarbók had been bound in 2 large, resplendent, so-called Cambridge panel bindings, dating from around 1750, in brown calf that was worn and delicate on account of its age, but nevertheless, they were beautiful. The binding is, as we saw, probably not quite as old as Jakobsen conjectures. The late historian Carsten Christensen, who readily has discussed many of the points here put forward and shared many of his own findings with me, guesses in a private letter that the bookbinder must have been one of the 3, Antoni's widow, Wilhelmi, or Hjort, who all worked in Copenhagen at this time. Regrettably, it hasn't been possible to get the answer any closer in the library archives. Period 2. In this second period, with more regular circumstances for the library, Flateyjarbók is mainly used for various editions, which I won't go specially into detail about, though it would be interesting to mention that the first 17 facsimiles from the book, all concerning the discovery of America, were published in 1890 by Arthur Middleton Reeves. Only a few years later, in 1893, the topographic department of the Royal Danish Staff published large facsimiles of parts of the book concerning the same subject matter. The last publication was in a way the conclusion of a certain political case involving Flateyjarbók, in connection with the upcoming The World's Columbian Exposition, commemorating the discovery of America by Columbus, which was going to be held in Chicago, 1893, the American government took contact to the Danish government through the diplomatic channels. They requested a loan of Flateyjarbók, and the Danish government was sympathetic to the inquiry. An official statement was required from the Royal Library and other academic authorities, who all maintained that the book should not be lent for the exposition. The whole case was debated in Parliament and even in the newspapers of the time, where different opinions surfaced. Some emphasized the dangers of the voyage and of the manuscript being on display in America, far away, while others saw it instead as an opportunity to assert Denmark's international reputation. This clearly was a case of great public interest, and many arguments were put forward for not lending the manuscript to the Americans. The academic authorities, and not least the director of the Royal Library, Christian Bruun, remained clear in his protest against acceding to the American request, but the Danish government nevertheless decided to maintain their stand over against all authorities and went forward with preparing the loan. It was, no doubt, therefore perturbing when the government learned that the Americans were not willing to accept the Danish lending requirements, which were quite elaborate. And thus the great book stayed in the vaults in the Royal Library for almost another 100 years. Period 3. There's no archive of material about any repairs or anything else for that matter done to Flateyjarbók in this period. It would perhaps be interesting to mention, though, a letter which Christian Kålund from the Armenian Commission sent to the Royal Library upon receiving 2 manuscripts which had been on loan in order to be photographed. When the manuscripts, AM 226 and 227 folio, arrived back at the University Library, they showed traces of unnecessary wash, resulting in a blurring of the writing and changing in the color of the parchment. Kålund impresses that the use of water or any form of chemicals is forbidden, except with specially given permission, of course. In the answer from the library, we are told that this has been impressed on the employee concerned, the photographer. This does point to a very different attitude to manuscripts, not only from today, but also between the 2 institutions at the time. The Royal Library apparently were more liberal in their overall attitude. The great achievement in this period is most certainly the publication of the complete facsimile of Flateyjarbók, the first volume in 2 tomes of the impressive Corpus Codicum Islandicorum series. It was the publisher Einar Munksgaard who undertook the work with the publication, and Professor Finnur Jónsson wrote the introduction. But the whole plan would have come to nothing had it not been for the substantial economic contribution by the pharmacist and bibliophile A.E. Sibbesen. Actually more than that, because Sibbesen and Munksgaard got the idea to a facsimile edition of Flateyjarbók simultaneously, as it says in the little preface to the edition. The idea of producing a facsimile edition of the Flateyjarbók occurred simultaneously to the bibliophile Mr. A.E. Sibbesen and myself, Munksgaard says. And in a letter to Munksgaard, Sibbesen underlines this, or perhaps corrects it a bit. I have discovered that I'm not a bit better than anyone else is. From time to time, I've read of Einar Munksgaard's achievement of publishing the Book of Flateyjarbók, and I've felt it like a little sting, because the achievement is yours, but as surely as I am the father, the child is mine. I can prove it without any blood sample that I conceived it. Well, we leave it at that. No sources in the Royal Library archive can shed light on the process of producing the photograph material of the book, which was carried out at the Royal Library. But the 30th of June, 1929, Munksgaard ordered it. And finally, a year later, the great gift to the Icelandic people came out for the world to see. As there's no archive material, we also don't know anything about whether the manuscript has been repaired in any way when the photographers were working with it. It's not until 1971 where the final preparations before the transfer to Iceland of Flateyjarbók and Codex Regius of the Poetic Edda were carried out that a few notes, well, almost footnotes, appears. According to the conservators' work journals, the 2 manuscripts were in the workshop for 3 days from the 13th to the 16th of April. There's no notes on the work, which means that it was only minor repairs, but it was, nevertheless, quite a few such. Conservator Mette Jacobsen's retrospective remarks in 1996, when the last manuscripts had been sent off to Iceland. We only had a few days at our disposal for this task. Birgitte Dahl and I were alone in the workshop that week, so we were kept very busy. There were several things that needed doing to the 3 volumes, which were now to set out on the long voyage to Iceland as the first of the Icelandic manuscripts to return home. And so we reached the end. On the one hand, we got an answer to our opening question of whether Flateyjarbók was ever bound in one volume. It was, and we even found a strong pointer that the rebinding happened in connection with Jón Eriksson's reordering and cataloguing of the manuscript collection in the Royal Library. On the other hand, Flateyjarbók seems to show to us that a book can almost be an agent in history. Right from the beginning, when Brynjólfur sends the book to the king, and the king's ordering Torfæus to translate the text, and the Swedes' willingness to pay a considerable price for the book, but were turned down. All this is part of the rivalry between Denmark and Sweden about national history. Then there was the case of the never carried out loan to America of Flateyjarbók that teased out different ideological and thus political stances. And finally, the whole case of transferring the Icelandic manuscripts would probably never have found its solution had Flateyjarbók not been part of the final agreement. With these words, I conclude this quick tour through the Danish part of the history of the noblest Icelandic treasure of Northern Treasure, and hand over the lead. Thank you.
Kærar þakkir, Johnny. Við höfum tíma fyrir spurningar og hér mikrofón sem að hún Ingibjörg mun bera til þeirra sem að brenna eftir að fá að spyrja. Í millitíðinni fæ ég kannski að skjóta inn einni. Should I do this in English, perhaps, for the benefit of... Allavega, ég gera það á hvort ekki. Ég var að hugsa þegar þú varst að tala lánið, þetta fyrirhugaða lán árið 1893, sem merkileg saga. Heldur að það hafi öll svo umræða sem fór fram þá hafi í rauninni kannski stuðlað að því að þessi hugmynd kom upp hjá Sibbetsen og þeim að gefa út faksímili útgáfuna. So do you think that all the debate around the 1893 loan to Chicago would have kind of spurred people on when they later wanted to produce the facsimile edition?
Well, it is possible. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of letters between Sibbetsen and Einar Munksgaard, but unfortunately, it's only from the time when they were working with the manuscript edition. So we can't tell for sure, but it's only a few years prior to this, so it would be very obvious that men like Einar Munksgaard and Sibbetsen, who were, well, not nationalists, but thinking of national honor and the like, they were thinking of it at that time. And the edition of the parts, the Danish edition from 1893 of parts of the manuscript is, I mean, I think it only was published in a very few examples, so it would be. I think it's likely that this spurred the idea in a way.
I think I might just do this without the microphone. So thank you very much. I was wondering, so what was it they did for the manuscript before it was transported back to Iceland? I seem to remember that the two volumes, they were not transported in a casing of any sort, but rather to judge from photographs, I think they were just wrapped in paper or something. Am I right?
No. There were two boxes which still exist here.
Okay.
But I mean, so there were many things that needed to be done, she says?
Yes.
But there is no description of what...
No. The work journals, there's no notes there. So, and that should mean that it was only minor things, but a lot of minor things. So, but there's no record of anything, unfortunately.
Ein spurning til, áður en að við förum að næsta, já, gjörðu svo vel.
Could you elaborate more, on the Danish demands about the loan potential loan to Americans? You said the demands are too strict.
Well, it has been a long time since I read it, but it was, first of all, the transport of the manuscript. The Danes wanted a warship to collect the manuscript and bring it to America, of course. I mean, we did that. And then at the exhibition, they wanted, there were all kinds of rules about how to, the manuscript had to be in a safe box at night and take it out, put it into a special made box during the day time, and there had to be 1 or 2 persons always guarding the manuscript, one from Denmark and one from America. And more things like this, but I can't really remember all the details, but it was quite elaborate, and a little team of people from Denmark should travel with the manuscript, so it was very expensive as well, apart from having a ship, a warship. I think that's sailing over the Atlantic. So.
Kæra þakkir, Johnny. Næsti fyrirlesari forvörður hjá okkur á stofnun Árna Magnússonar, hún Vasarė Rastonis, og hún hefur síðustu 5 árin borið hitan og þungan af verkefninu og verið í forystu þar. Hún ætlar að tala, hennar erindi heitir Flateyjarbók at present. Gjörðu svo vel. Svona ekki svo hér. Þetta á milli. Takk.
During this presentation, I'll endeavor to share with you the conservation of Flateyjarbók, focusing on the stages of the Codex's transformation after it was returned to Iceland. Without diving too deeply into dates, but for a bit of background, here are a few for reference, some of which you've already heard. The manuscript was written between 1387 and 1394 in Iceland. It was bound into 2 volumes at the Royal Library in Copenhagen around 1783. In 1929, the manuscript was disbound and photographed for the printing of a black and white facsimile, then recased into the Royal Library bindings. Flateyjarbók was returned to Iceland on the 21st of April in 1971, and in 1994, the manuscript's condition was assessed, beginning the conservation phase. Flateyjarbók at present. A sizable codex comprised of approximately 110 calfskins arranged into 29 gatherings, making up 225 calf parchment leaves. How did the 14th century manuscript come to be bound in this manner? When Flateyjarbók was returned to Iceland in 1971, it arrived in 2 volumes bound in the Royal Library's decorative style. The English or Cambridge panel design is distinctly of the 18th century, incorporating mottled calfskin with gold and blind-tooled decorations around the central panels of both covers, gold-tooled red and green leather spine labels, striped endbands, and marbled paper end leaves. Unusually for this style of binding, the head, tail, and forages of the manuscript's book blocks were not trimmed in preparation for a gold leaf or color application, thus retaining its impressive dimensions. In 1929, the decorative covers were temporarily removed from the 2 volumes so that the manuscript could be disbound and photographed for the printed facsimile. The book blocks were then resewn and recased into the 18th century covers. This, as well as the use of Flateyjarbók over time, created stresses and damages to the two volumes. In 1994, upon recognizing the manuscript's condition needed to be addressed, Deputy Director Sigurgeir Steingrímsson invited Christopher Clarkson, the late preeminent conservator, to evaluate the manuscript. During Clarkson's visit in October 1994 and February 2007, he recommended that the manuscript undergo minimal treatment and be rebound in the Royal Library bindings or into two new bindings, depending on the findings of the treatment's previous steps. In preparation for the conservation survey, Clarkson also designed a detailed condition form. The practical conservation work was postponed until 2013 when Árnastofnunar's conservator at the time, Hersteinn Brynjólfsson, invited fellow conservator Jiři Vnouček to assess Flateyjarbók with him. The two had met while studying at Westdean College in England, where Christopher Clarkson taught. In February, they carried out an assessment of Flateyjarbók with the thought that the manuscript would remain in the Royal Library bindings, and in October, they began a thorough survey of the first volume using Clarkson's form. The condition review was aided with the use of the printed facsimiles black and white images, which could be studied alongside the manuscript. During the initial stage of treating the first volume, it became evident that the rebinding effort carried out in 1929 had caused structural issues. For context, when a book block is bound in a complex fashion like that of the Royal Library bindery, each binding is uniquely constructed around each book block. So, when in 1929 the freshly disbound volumes were recased, the binder had to resew the two book blocks and fit them into covers that were no longer a perfect match. One solution for this issue, the one used for Flateyjarbók, would have been to apply a generous amount of adhesive along the book block spine to join it to the cover and to reinforce that attachment with adhered cloth strips over the inner joints. Very often, this remedy can create a very tight-fitting cover, which then causes stresses elsewhere in the bound book, as was found to be the case by the conservators. They noticed that the thick adhesive layer along the spine had scattered cracks and continued to crack each time the manuscript was handled, posing a risk to splitting the parchment's surface. In addition, the adhesive was dangerously close to areas with decorative initials, and in one case on top of the media, as seen in the center image. It was at this point that Hersteinn and Jiři decided to completely disbind the first volume to arrest any further damage. In the summer of 2015, Hersteinn retired, and the Flateyjarbók conservation project was paused until early 2018, when Jiři Svanhildar Óskarsdóttur and I met to discuss next steps. The first volume had been disbound, and the second volume was to follow, so continuing with how the first volume had been surveyed, a detailed condition report of the second volume was made using Clarkson's form. In addition, the pigments and inks were checked for stability, and since they were not actively friable or flaking, the treatment began. The process of detaching the cover from the book block involved lifting the cloth strips from off of the inner joints and cutting support cords to access the spine so that the cover could be separated from the book block. Attention was then turned to removing remaining calfskin fibers from the manuscript spine and reducing the generous layer of adhesive. For this, a few methods were used, beginning with agarose gel cuboids strapped into place with polyethylene strips over the spine to remove the leather and soften the adhesive. Using this technique supported a slow and methodical approach that helped in identifying the quality of the older adhesives and what may be required to reduce and remove the layer. When we continued using viscous poultice of methyl cellulose to soften and remove the adhesive layer on the spine. This process was carried out in short spans so as not to overwhelm the parchment with moisture. For the same reason, when it was necessary to apply a second poultice, the applications were staggered. Attention was especially paid to the areas around the sewing stations so that the linen cords and threads could be loosened from the spine. This time lapse shows 1 hour of adhesive removal, looped, and condensed into 37 seconds. Well over 100 hours were spent on this phase of the project. And while this can be a meditative activity, it was great fun sharing part of this phase with Jiři. I learned that he has excellent taste in music. Once the sewing threads and cords were removed, the partially obstructed 14th century sewing stations were uncovered, as were the bright red sewing station markings of the Royal Library bindery. These marks were made prior to sewing to indicate where the raised cords were to be laid out along the spine in keeping with the style of the binding. Whereas the 14th century structure has 6 sewing stations, the 18th century structure has 7. Then, in July 2018, with great celebration, the 2 disbound volumes were reunited. My colleagues' excitement at this moment was wonderful to witness, especially knowing their history with the manuscript. It was also satisfying to see the sewing stations align once the 2 halves were stacked together. Not only did the sewing stations correspond, so did the topography of the last quire of the first volume and the first quire of the second volume, as seen here with the help of raking light. Conservators learn early on that various materials have memory, and here we see that memory reflected in the surface undulations of the facing parchment folia that have not flattened even after separation over 2 centuries prior. On the left, the parchment forms a slight mound at center, and on the right, the parchment forms a matching well. Around this time, conversations began in earnest about how the manuscript should be bound, as 1 volume or 2, and how. When considering binding techniques for Flateyjarbók, we had a few goals in mind, primarily constructing a non-adhesive structure informed by historic examples which promoted flexible and yet controlled mobility for when the manuscript is in use, and that new materials meet conservation standards. But there was a bit more adhesive to address after the quires had been separated from one another. The final adhesive removal phase focused on the residue in the sewing stations and any remaining along the inner and outer spine folds. Much of this work was carried out using a microscope so that vulnerable areas, such as those with pigment, could be cautiously worked around. Next, a comparative review of the existing repairs was made of the second volume alongside the printed facsimile. Here we might be able to answer your question, Haraldur. Repairs from at least 2 separate campaigns were observed, those present prior to 1929 as documented in the facsimile, and those added just before 1971 when Flateyjarbók returned to Iceland. In several instances, mends made before 1929 were removed or trimmed and either covered with toned paper or remended in 1970. The study of these different repairs offered perspective in thinking about if and how existing mends and fills should be treated, and where additional repairs to the parchment leaves may be made. Many of the older mends successfully stabilized damaged areas, and ultimately only in a few places were previous mends consolidated, altered, or removed. One such older repair chosen for removal was located at the head edge of the first bifolium, bridging the spine fold. It was constructed of 3 pieces of parchment and multiple layers of toned paper. The fill was so thick that the bifolium had a restricted opening, especially along the upper half. When the older mend was completely removed, the loss was filled with toned paper, as seen in the lower right image in process and completed at upper right. When reviewing the parchment leaves for areas that had not been repaired and required stabilization, not many of the 225 leaves were in need of additional attention. There were several edge tears and spine fold losses, such as the one displayed, that were mended or filled with toned paper. Because the project was given ample time, we were able to perform a series of surveys while the manuscript was disbound. Information was collected about the parchment bifolia size and thickness range, various repairs, deformations of the 14th century sewing holes, pigments and their condition, as well as taking eraser rubbing samples for the Beasts to Craft DNA project. In addition, transmitted light images were taken of the entire manuscript, leaf by leaf, in spring of 2019. Here is a selection of those images that show the variety of qualities in the skins, such as the pair of images in the upper right corner that show the calf's spine direction across the leaves, and the lower central pair that exhibit the parchmenter's scrape marks. We had begun discussing the possibility of media analysis with Dr. Maurizio Aceto in 2019 with tentative plans for 2020. But as we know, 2020 was a different type of year. As the analysis was thought best carried out while the manuscript was unbound, Flateyjarbók was placed into an enclosure for storage. While waiting for a time to schedule the media analysis, a variety of bookbinding models based on historic structures were sewn to help determine a path forward. Each step of the bookbinding process built upon the previous step, attempting to establish a structure that would promote controlled movement of the substantial manuscript. One of the more challenging aspects of this project was sourcing materials that would suit the manuscript, especially without being able to see and feel the materials in person. Thoughts about appropriate material sources percolated throughout the various phases of the project and eventually settled into place. Then, in late summer of 2021, during a week focused on pigments and inks, Dr. Aceto, joined by his colleague Dr. Angelo Agostino, carried out analysis of a selection of pigments in Flateyjarbók, as well as in 22 additional Icelandic manuscripts. The week was made complete with Cheryl Porter, who led a hands-on workshop in preparing pigments of the medieval palette. As Lea will be speaking about this colorful phase of the project in a short while, I leave this to say that this week was a high point of the project, especially after the challenges of the preceding year and a half. After media analysis, it was time to turn all attention to the rebinding. Last May, the manuscript was sewn together with calf parchment end leaves using toned Irish linen thread over alum-tawed calfskin sewing supports. The supports were made of 3 layers of calfskin adhered together with gelatine to ensure strength and controlled flexibility. The search for parchment from which to make the end leaves took some time, but concluded after a few discussions with the good people at William Cowley Parchment Makers in England, who were able to provide calf parchment that was not bright white and not white, not too thin nor too thick, but could complement the raw umber toned parchment of Flateyjarbók. After some failed attempts and finding 4 suitable skins, I was a touch anxious for the arrival of the parcel and eager to see the selection. Upon opening the cardboard tube, which was witnessed by Svanhildar, a wave of relief washed over me at seeing the beautiful skins with their veiny details and neutral, undyed coloration that suited the manuscript's leaves. Discussions about sourcing wooden boards had begun in 2019, and one afternoon, while in conversation with Gísli Sigurðsson, we learned of a friend of his who could provide us with wooden boards cut from larch driftwood, the very driftwood that rests piled along the northern coast of the West Fjords upon completing a journey of thousands of kilometers through eddies and freezing and thawing cycles of the Arctic Sea. This wonderful idea resonated with us all, and so we requested a sample of a sizable larch board from Ketill Guðfinnsson. Unfortunately, the widest plank that could be cut from the driftwood was not wide enough for Flateyjarbók. In addition, the cut of the larch plank was live sawn, which wasn't planarly stable. Ideally, quarter sawn hardwood planks needed to be sourced from which flat and stable binding boards could be made. In spring of 2021, after reaching out to John Gillis, conservator at Trinity College, Dublin, for advice on finding a source of quarter sawn hardwood, he wrote that he happened to have a stock of planks that he had cut from an oak tree on the grounds of the Glenstall Abbey in Limerick, Ireland. Unfortunately, he did not have planks large enough to accommodate Flateyjarbók. Incredibly, he also had a stock of quarter-sawn beech wood from a tree felled from the very same grounds of the abbey, and was able to send us 3 planks, 1 extra just in case. And just like with the calf parchment, the arrival of the golden beech boards was another high point of the project. Shortly after the manuscript had been sewn, the beech planks were placed into Ketill's capable hands to be cut, sanded, and shaped into bookboards with channels and tunnels carved out for the alum-tod sewing supports. Several times during the early summer months, Ketill would appear magically to check in with his progress, with each visit allowing for a glimpse at the wood's transformations. Similarly to receiving the parcels of parchment and beech planks, Ketill's beech board visits were delightful, and his patience and careful attention were much appreciated. The boards were laced onto the alum-tod supports this past October over the course of 2 days. The support ends reaching out of the outer set of tunnels, as seen in the image on the right, were trimmed and secured using beech pegs tapped into the holes. Then the area around the supports was lightly sanded so that the alum-tod supports and wooden pegs would not lie proud of the board's inner and outer surfaces. Once all seemed in order, it was time to open the front cover, turn the leaves, check the inner folds of the quires, and inspect the mobility of the manuscript. Early in this project, concern was raised about the size of the manuscript and whether it was too large and unwieldy to be rebound into 1 volume. This thought remained with me throughout the process of rebinding, and while yes, this is a large codex, it is not unwieldy. In fact, its weight promotes a controlled mobility, and the flexible sewing supports offer a counterbalance to the rigid parchment leaves. When thinking about future handling of the manuscript, in a way, it seems that the manuscript will handle the audience by subtly commanding a careful approach while it is being studied. A few more steps need to be taken before this phase of Flateyjarbók can be considered set. One is to construct an overcover for the wooden board's binding. Last year, in the winter months, on separate occasions and within a few weeks of each other, I met 2 people who told me about Lena Zachariasen. They described her with such reverence that it seemed that a trip to Hjaltadé to visit her was destined. Last summer, upon meeting her and seeing her work, it was clear that Lena would be an excellent source for the leather needed to fashion an overcover. And so now, during this slow season, we wait patiently for news from a farm in Viðidalstunga for the birth of a stillborn calf, which will be transformed into material for Flateyjarbók's binding, to then complete this iteration along the manuscript's continuum. Thank you for your attention, and thank you especially to Svanhildar for organizing this event.
In Eins og þið heyrðu þá hafa margar vinnustundir og ótrúlega mikil hugkvæmni og hugmyndavinna farið fram í þessu verkefni og það nú á engan hallað held ég þó að við þökkum Vasarė alveg sérstaklega fyrir. Ég vil gefa þér gott klapp. Og fyrir mig ómetanlegt og lærdómsríkt að fá að fylgjast með. En nú ég viss að þið hafið alls konar spurningar af því að hér fór nú margt fram. Sem að nota hérna þetta því að þá heyrist ekki sveimur í skýrslunni, þannig að ég spila svona það. Það Haraldur ætlar að bæta ráð sitt núna og spyrja aftur í mikrofóninn.
Thank you so much, Vasarė, for an incredibly interesting presentation. I've got two questions, if I may. The first one, are there any signs of wear on the outside of the choirs, suggesting that maybe the book wasn't bound right away? Oh. And the second one, would there have been, in the original binding in the 14th century, would there have been any kind of adhesive substance used at all?
Excellent questions. To the first, I can't say that there is anything. I think that spine has been reworked at least 2 times, so we know that it was glued up in the 18th century and then glued up again after the facsimile was made. And I think, yeah, I can't say that I saw anything. And then, I'm sorry, could you repeat your second question? I'm, flustered being up here.
So the second regards if there was any adhesive material used in the Middle Ages for binding.
My sense is no. We see more adhesive used in later centuries. But I don't believe that it was a practice at that time. So using those original sewing stations and sewing onto potentially cord would have been a practice, and then lacing the cord through potentially wooden boards. So, yep.
I just want to add that there are there are the slots for the ticketing of individual choirs, which actually prove that the scribes have used them contemporary, and on several choirs of the Flateyjarbók they are still preserved on the head and the foot of the manuscript. That was the part of your question.
Fleiri spurningar. Meðan þið hugsið ykkur þá langar mig aðeins að bara nefna að það voru allar þessar hugmyndur hvaðan fengist efni í umbúnaðinn í bandið og ef að þetta gengur nú upp með kálfinn og með Lenu að þá næst mjög góð tenging bæði náttúrulega við Víðidalstungu og svo við Norega því að Lena norsk. Þannig að þetta eru Noregskonungasögur og svo finnst mér þó að við varum mjög skotin í hugmyndunum rekaviðinn að þá þegar þetta endaði í því að við fengjum beiki úr írskum klausturgarði þá var nú góð Atlantshafs tenging þar svo að þetta kemur einhvern veginn allt saman svo fallega heim og saman. Nú, engar fleiri spurningar? Nei, þá tölum við meira tré. Því að nú komið að Ketill Guðfinnssoni, trésmiði, sem ætlar að segja okkur af þætti trételgju af Hornströndum í viðgerð Flateyjarbókar. Gjörðu svo vel, Ketill. aðeins að fara að slökkva. Getum kannski sett bara hérna aftur myndina, býttu nú við. Svona.
Já, góði gestir. Þetta kallað þátt trételgju af Hornströndum í viðgerðarþætti Flateyjarbókar. Og allt hefur upphaf og þar jafnan best að byrja söguna. Til mér hringdi maður af Orlagi fyrir nokkrum misserum, kynnti sig sem Gísla Sigurðsson á Árnastofnun. Þekkti ég strax að þar var kominn jarlinn að Þarlótusfirði. En fjörður sá næstur fyrir norðan Reykjafjörð, hvaðan í upprunnin. Það var erindi hans að spyrja mig hvort ég vildi láta svo lítið og finna sig og Vasarė forvörð sem inniða forvörslu og viðgerð þjóðargerseminnar Flateyjarbókar. Hafði þeim komið til hugar að gaman gæti orðið hægt væri að fá reka við á ströndum, ekki síst rauðavið í bókarspjöldin. Voru þau með í huga Eiríksóið rauða sem bjó á Dröngum, norðan við skörtin, samkvæmt mínum skilningi og okkar strandamanna. En saga hans ein af reifurónum í Flateyjarbók, þessu búð. Hvar drangar Eiríks voru þó nokkuð á reiki. Mér þótti þetta en besta hugmynd, mundi þó ekki eftir svo sveru rauðarviðatré að dygðu í spjöld sögunar. Hvaðst þó myndi ganga mín að reka sumarið og spyrjast fyrir hjá öðrum hvort þeir hefði yfir að ráða svo gildu tré að duga mætti. En sníða þarf efnið úr trénu með sérstökum hætti til þess að það verpi sig ekki viðurinn þornar. Að hausti kom ég af ströndum, tjáði ég þeim Vasarի og Gísla ekkert brúklegt rekaviðartré væri í boði. Þau tóku þessu af alkunnu jafnaðargeði. Virtust nánast hafa búist við þessu og skiptu þegar í plan B. Sagði Vasarė að frændur formaður okkar Íslendinga á Írlandi byggju enn að fornum bókviðar eða beikiskógum hvaðan hafa mætti nothæfan við. Þeir væru að vísu nokkuð syngir á þessi sínu takmörkuðu og síminkandi gæði, en hún taldi sig með blíðmælgi geta haft af þeim fjalabúta dyga mundu. Veturinn bárust mér boð að fjalirnar væru komnar. Ég kom að líta á þær, spurði Gísli mig hvort ég teldi aðra hæfari en mig til að höggva þær til og forma. Ég svaraði að fyllsta lítillæti að ég teldi svo ekki vera. Var það komið að þætti Vasarė að koma mér í skilningum hvernig hún hugsaði sér að spjöldin yrðu. Dróum fram ýmis handrit og sýndi mér tréverkið. Eitt handritið af starfið okkar verkefni sem bundið var í gljállakkaða hnotu eða mahóni var með formi sem hún vildi að haft yrði til hliðsjónar við telginguna. Ég hélt nú til minnar vinnustofu með fjalirnar undir hendinni, ásamt með pappaspjöldum sýndu hver stærð fjalanna skildi vera, svo málsett þver og langsnið. Ég bar pappaspjöldin frá Vasarė við fjalirnar, kom í ljós að þær voru óþarflega knaft skornar og ekki hótréttar. Kom okkur Vasarė saman að hinn knappari fjölin skildi í bakli bókarinnar. Þá tók ég nú til við að höggva viðinn og kúpa frá fjölina skildi í bakliðina. Vegna þess að við höfum alltaf talað að höggva til spjöldin, notaði ég sjálfsögðu öxi og svo aðra til þess að skafa með og slétta. Að lokum var skafið með siklingi til þess að fá sem sléttasta og mýksta áferð. Ég fór nokkrum sinnum vestur í Árnastofnun til þess að bera undir Vasarė form og útlit fjallarinnar. Hún var sátt við útlitið, var hinn í fjölunni gerð sömu skil. Þegar báðar fjalirnar voru snikkaðar í rétt horn var handrit sjálfar Flateyjarbókar lagt í millum þeirra og strikað fyrir þverböndum þeim ásaumuðum halda skyldi spjöldunum við efnið. Ég fór nú enn heim í mína vinnustofu með spjöldin ásamt og með ljósritum úr handrita viðgerðarbókum og málsettum sniðum af götum og grópum fyrir böndin halda skyldi öllu sömlu saman. Það var seinlegt verk og tafsamt að gera téð göt og grópir en hafðist. Þessu var lokið í byrjun sumars fór ég með spjöldin út í Árnagarð, var vasanir ekki við svo ég baði með þau sett í góða gemslu þar til hún kæmi. Þess má geta að reynt var að halda frekar háu rakastíu á vinnustofunni og spjöldin vafin í pappír og rökum klútum í umbúðum milli þess auðnu var við þau. Fór ég síðan á Strandur norður að kljúfa við og þjóna lund minni. Seinni part sumars barst mér símtal. Í símanum var Vasarė Rastonis. Bauðst hún margfallega afsökunar á truflun þessari á þjónkun minni við lundina, spurði nær ég kæmi til byggða. Hana langaði að ræða við mig augliti til auglitis spjöld sögunar, hvort þinna mætti þau ögn. Ég kom norðan, fór ég til fundar við Vasarė og að athuguðu máli töldum við að það mætti gerast með því að nema af innri hlið þeirra. Kom okkur saman að nema sem nam 3 millimetrum af þykktinni. Þess áður getið að ég leitaðist við að nota sem mest handverkfæri en ekki vélar eða sandapír. Nú sá ég mér þó þann kostvænstan að brjóta odd af álæti mínu, sættast við rafmagnsfræsarann og láta hann skammta mér þykkt þess efnis fjarlæga skyldi. Síðan var skorið og skafið, sléttað og strokið þar til ásættanleg áferð náðist. Og ég viðurkenni að ég lofaði með sjálfum mér þá ákvörðun að binda bókina í 1 bindi en ekki 2 eins og verið hafði þegar herskipi flutti hana heim árið og allir muna. Ég þakka gott ljóð.
Ketill, viltu staldra hérna aðeins við svo við bjóðum fólki að spyrja því spurningar líka eins og hinn. Mér langar að spyrja þig sjálf, eitthvert verk sem þú hefur unnið sem að líkist þessu?
Ekki minnist ég þess.
En myndirðu kannski vera fáanlegu til að vinna slíkt verk aftur ef svo bæri undir?
Það annað mál.
Mjög gott. Eru hér spurningar í salnum? Any questions to Ketill? Ég vissum við getum þýtt á milli mála ef að svo ber undir. So we can translate. Já, gjörðu svo vel.
Takk fyrir skemmtilegt erindi. Engin hætta á að þessi svona viðarspjöld vindist til? Þú sagðir að það hafi verið haldið miklu háu rakastíð með að vinna þetta. Hvernig það?
Ástæðan fyrir því að ég reyndi að hafa hátt rakastig þegar ég var að vinna þetta að á venjulegu trésmiðjuvestæði eitthvert þurrasta loft sem finnst á Íslandi. En handritin eru aftur geymd við frekar hátt hitastig, hátt rakastig fyrirgefðu og þegar að spjöldin eru komin á handritið þá æskilegt að rakastig þeirra sé svona í ætt við það sem á handritunum og þarf að vera í geymslunum. Annars hætt á, eins og hann nefndir, að það vindi sig.
Var það ekki þannig með eina rekaviðarbútin sem að gerum tilraun með að hann vatt sig?
Jó, hann vatt sig eðlilega út af því að hann er skorinn allt öðruvís úr trénu heldur en þarf að vera í bókarspjöld sem eiga að vera svona bein en ekki svona eða svona eða bundin og.
Einmitt.
Já, takk kærlega fyrir mjög áhugavert efni og skemmtilegt. Ég að velta fyrir mig hvað þú getur sagt okkur úrval tegunda rekaviðs á ströndum og kannski spáði hvernig þetta var hérna áður fyrr og í dag.
Já, það nú það. Það var töluvert úrval af rekavið á ströndum, að vísu ekki margar tegundir, en þó nokkrar og það algengustu eru fura og greni og svo óþurftar spýtur sem kallaðar voru selja og var ekki hægt að nota neitt valla undir maskinuna, í maskinuna undir pottana. Og svo reyndar rauðaviður sem að gífurlega sterkur viður og lerki frá Síberíu en hefur einn ókost fram yfir margan annan við að hann breytir sér mjög mikið við vætu en öðru leyti ákaflega sterkur og nánast ódrepandi ef hann liggur ekki í jörð.
Fleiri? Spurningar vakna? Já, Lea.
Ég var að spá hvað þessi tréspjöld eru þung. Bara svona Flateyjarbókin, 7 kíló. Hvað eru spjöldin þung?
Þyngdin sennilega
I don't know what the wood weight is. I'm sorry.
Heildar sem sagt þyngd bókarinnar núna 7 kíló.
Ég get upplýst að spjöldin eru ekki þöng og það var ekki erfitt að halda þeim vestur í Árnastofnun þó ég notaði bíl til þess en ég var heldur fljótar í förum þannig.
Mjög gott. Eru fleiri spurningar til Ketills? Næst á, ef svo ekki þá förum við að þakka þér aftur. Við höfum haldið svo vel á spöðunum að við erum aðeins á undan áætlun. Ég vona samt að það sé tilbúið kaffi fyrir okkur og við gætum þá bara miðað við að byrja hér aftur klukkan 3. Þess að korteri fyrr, og gjörðu þið svo vel, það á að vera kaffi og hjónabandsæla í boði hér frammi. Var þetta komið hérna inn á?
Já, þetta hérna.
Do you have a pointer? Do you have a pointer?
Öllum bænum vantar fólki tala inn í bókar.
Heyrist það ekki vel? Nei, too bad. Var það aldrei?
Can I download?
Nei, það er að vera nær. Já, einmitt. Ég vil gera það. Heldur að sé hérna bendill, eða þú veist? Ég finn það ekki, sko. Þú finnur hann ekki? Nei. Þá hefjum við leika að nýju og við fáum nú annan forvörð sem þið hafið nú þegar séð myndir af og heyrt tónlistarsmekk hans. It's a pleasure to introduce Jiři Vnouček from the Royal Library in Copenhagen. He's going to talk to us about the parchment of Flateyjarbók.
I need a laser. Yes.
Yeah, there it is. Excellent.
Do we have a laser? Yes. We need a laser. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be here after such a long time. And what I'm going to do today is basically a report of the work of progress from information which I gathered here when I was here last time in November 2019 as a part of the Beast2 craft team. And we've been, or I was looking at the parchment of the Flateyjarbók, which I of course seen before, but we have selected several choirs. But first of all, I want to say that I have asked my colleague from Cambridge, Matthew Teasdale, to send me a nice picture so I could show him. And that's what he sent me. So you can see he is in his sterile environment working with the DNA. So that's Matthew Teasdale, who is important part of the project. Right, and okay, that was too fast. So these are 5 choirs which were selected for a little bit closer analyze, mostly visual, but as Vasarė said before, we've been documenting the different features which we found on parchment already in the condition reports designed by Chris Clarkson. And so this was like a little closer look. And one of the things was the sampling of for DNA analysis, which are supposed to be done or which are actually happening now in Cambridge by my colleague Matthew Teasdale. And beside of that, we done the, I would say, other things like visual observation of the anatomy of the animal, so what we could learn about animal measurement. Vasarė already mentioned some things, measurement thickness, observation of the traces from production, and I also did some experimental parchment making, and I'm still trying to figure out how potentially the parchment, not only of the Flateyjarbók, but the Icelandic manuscript in general, could be made. So here is what delivered so far. Matthew Teasdale, you might be not very, it doesn't maybe tell you too much, but I can tell you the message is very good. And in fact, it's rather amazing that all 22 samples have, after extraction, went very well and have a very high concentration of DNA. And now listen, you will like it because you are Icelanders, which can't be compared with any Latin manuscript in Europe. And that's something to do with the way of production of parchment. I'm going to talk about it later. But so far, extraction is done. sequencing is coming, and it's a very long time process, expensive process, and the results, hopefully, will be presented at the Care and Conservation Seminar in April in Copenhagen this year. So I will better focus on my stuff, or stuff we did also with Vasarė. That's the measurement of the sizes. When I speak about the measurement of the sizes, I always keep in my mind the size of the animal, because that's one of the major reasons why I measure the manuscripts or like this, because I want to see how big potentially animal might be. And you can see I'm not so much interested about actually one folio, but about two folio together, which we call bifolio, because that's, in the case of the Flateyjarbók, almost always one skin. And the project of the Flateyjarbók, the conservation, actually represent a unique situation that the whole manuscript was this bound. Well, I mean, it's happening quite often, but also I'm now speaking about the sizes, the large manuscript. And it gives an exceptionally possibility to study various anatomic features and other things at once. Because normally when I'm working and doing this, I have to virtually connect the adjacent folio into one image, and if I try to look in transmitted light, I'm affected with the spine of the binding. So this project was very important and interesting chance to see more closely the skins. As you can see, there is a number of the larger folio. Of course, the folios are not equal. You can see, I will try to use my laser, okay? Does it work? So you can see there is, the edges are very uneven, so there is a difference like 5-8 millimeters through the whole text block, which is not such a big deal if you think about the animal. But of course, if you want to know exactly right. So one of the other things is actually measuring of the thickness of the parchment. Because we are talking about one skin, and the skin, I always have a tendency to say parchment is three-dimensional objects. And people very often think, well, it's just, the flat thing. No, it's three-dimensional. Even though the dimension is maybe not so big, it's still important, and you can compare it. And it gives you a lot of information and possible estimates which part of the animal you are looking. So you can see, for example, here where we have a neck of the animal. So here we have the thickest skin because we don't want the Icelandic tiger would kill the cow. So that's why it has a very strong skin here. On the other hand, of course, you have the belly parts, and then you have a spine, which again is slightly thicker. So it's important to measure not one measurement, which is done, of course, with the micrometer, but try to do this systematically. When I show you this, it doesn't mean I do it only with Flateyjarbók. I do it with many other books. So I have a certain comparison, and I can sort of see what is the difference between different manuscripts, different type of animals, etc. So you can see here that the minimum is 149, and maximum is almost 3 times more. So that's why we also do the average, because if we have average from 22 measurements, then it gives you that basic information and you can scan through the whole manuscript and get idea. So if someone is measuring 1 point somewhere without document, it doesn't really matter. It's really important to do this systematically. On the other hand, I have to say, I don't do the GPS of each point because it's impossible to do it exactly the same place. You can see like here, parts are missing, so you have to measure somewhere else. Or you have a decoration, you don't want to destroy or decoration, so you have to slightly move. So of course these measuring points are just kind of general. Right, so then we come to the observation of the animal spine. Vasarė already mentioned it on these lovely images in transmitted light. Now, some people think you need rocket technology to learn the things. Well, one of the best friend can be just backlight. And that's what we did. So this is the one of the bifolio looking, we are looking at the hair side of the bifolio on the light table, and which is the right way how to observe it. Put the flesh side on the bottom so the light nicely can penetrate. If you do it other way around, you don't see so much. Good to know. Right, and so here we can see the neck again, by the way, and that's the tail of the animal, and we can see the spine. Now, about the spine, you can see it's not completely central, and this is quite usual that the smaller skins are central and the bigger skins are sort of made like steps, so the spine of the animal is not exactly in one place because it would be too thick in very limited space. So this is a kind of rather clever way, which I observe in many other books, that they have sort of selected the skins in the right manner to fit in the quire. It's really complicated business. It might not look like, but it is. But I first maybe show you a little bit more about the anatomy, because if you see the actual manuscript, you might not be completely sure where we are looking. So that's the tail, which is gone, of course. However, we have the spine, which is, of course, central, because this is the whole skin. And we have the pelvis bone. The pelvis bone is one of the best places where to measure the size of the animal. And it's because the leather, the skin, is tight with the bone. There is no fat. So when the skin is removed and then processed, it became a little bit transparent. If you don't want to see it transparent, you can't do that. But very often it's seen transparent. So you can always find it and you can measure it. So I'm systematically measuring distance between these two pelvis bone and then sacrum, and that gives me the comparison with the other manuscripts, so I have an idea about the size of the animal. So anyway, we have the neck, and of course, this all is not used. It's reduced for the purpose of making of manuscripts, and so only the best part is used. However, if the skins are too small, of course the edges are very often preserved and the skins are smaller. Now, you might already notice the funny, strange hairs here. I'm going to talk about this later. So now, interesting thing, the Flateyjarbók does not have only vertical spine, but it has, horizontal placed spine, animal, but it has also vertical. And it has quite a remarkable number of them. Now, maybe you don't know what I'm going to say. Well, this says that some of the calves were much larger than the others, and the larger ones might be produced 2 bifolia and not only 1. So this is a very important thing. Again, people have a tendency to simplify the things and count the bifolia, so many skins down. No, it reduced and it quite changed the amount of the skins, not only in this manuscript, of course. So here we have the vertical spine, and you can also see lovely edges. And because this is reaching the outmost limit of the width of the skin, so we have included these parts of the belly, and they're very specific, and you can observe a very specific type of the hair orientation, etc. So of course, when I see the big manuscript like this, I can always navigate myself. But if you see the manuscript, which would be quarter size, you have to learn, if you imagine that it's a quarter size, so 4 before, if I see some specific feature, I need to know where I am on the map. Here it's easy. Right. So, but for those who are not so much familiar with the anatomy of your manuscripts at home, here is the detail of something what is called tail head. That's exactly the area where the tail of the calf is rising up, and here simply is nothing more than a tail, so it's removed. And here I put my little measure to show you the measuring distance between the sacrum and one of the pelvis bone peaks, and that's here another. And it's usually a range in case of Flateyjarbók, it's from 8 or 80 millimeters, 8 centimeters to 12, depending the size of the skin. But that's exactly what is quite usual. And I should also say that, of course, we have to realize that the sizes of the animals in medieval time was slightly different than in modern time. So it's quite a complicated business again. So for those who are interested in horizontal, here is also the same thing, the tail head and the pelvis and the spine of the animal. Now, if you see this little calf which was just born, she definitely doesn't look she wants to become a part of Icelandic written heritage. And I would say her mother quite agreed with her. However, this is the size of the animal you are looking for, because you can't really do the parchment from animals older than several weeks. And so if you read somewhere in literature, manuscript was written on cow, come on. Anyway, to bring you a better and closer idea about the dimension, you can watch this lovely calf, which is like several days or maybe a week old. And if you see the hands of Beate, that actually gives you the size of the manuscript, more or less. So you can use from neck to the tail. Maybe this hand should be here. And that's the head, tail head, which actually shows us a specific formation of the hairs on the parchment. Right. So I should better move to some of the traces. I have selected 3 of them. That's the one which, again, doesn't look so visible when you see the manuscript in normal light. However, if you see it in transmitted light, you can see this very strange shape. And what you can also notice, that the text is interrupted. So that means that the scribe was not writing over, and that means it was there already at the beginning. Now, this is very interesting. So now we could do some quiz. What do you think it is? How this happened? Anyone? Okay, we have not so much time. So when you work with your lunellum, you are removing slice by slice the surface to the proper thickness. And as soon as they are getting closer to the proper thickness, any wrong movement can cause that you go through the skin. And that's exactly what happened on this parchment. And again, I have to say, it's not unique for Flateyjarbók. You can see it in other manuscripts. But it's rather large in Flateyjarbók. And what I also like is the specific repairs. So it's sewn here in 2 places. And then there are some miniature patches over. I can't guarantee that they are original, like contemporary. They look quite old, but they might be remade later. So this actually documents that the parchment, when it was finished, it was so precious. And so even if some rather substantial defects were happening, it was still used. And again, I have to say this is not unique for Flateyjarbók. Right. So let's go now finally to DNA again. So one of the things which we discussed in the Beast and Craft was the way of preservation of DNA and proteins in parchment. And we have found out that the lime is not the best friend, because the lime have a tendency to destroy these informations. And that's why the amount or concentration of DNA or protein in the skins, in the manuscripts which were which skins were made through the lime process, it's much lower than, as we have heard, the promising one from Flateyjarbók. So I brought a few pictures which I did up in the north here with the other method of dehairing, which is kind of rotting in the river, and you just left your skin and you hope the tiger doesn't get it. And then, of course, you have to leave it for several weeks because the water, it's difficult to see, it's like 6 degrees. And of course, one of the major problem with the rotting is that because the skin is not equally thick, so it affects the different areas more rapidly than the others. That means that you are left with some areas. So you can see here, something goes easily with the hand, you just touch it and the hairs go off. Some other place, even with the knife, you can't remove. I mean, perhaps you could if you work super hard, but it's really impossible. So what is happening, that you are left with some hair on finished parchment. But that's not a problem, because you can remove it with your super shaped knife. And that's, again, something rather specific for Icelandic manuscript, because in the most European, I like the continental and Iceland, or so something like the English always say continental. So in the European manuscripts which were run through the lime, you actually pull all of the hairs, including the roots. But in this case, you do succeed with some of them, but the rest of them stay. It's no problem because you can shave it, as you can see here. And that's my experiment, and that's how it looked like after, if you just do it partially. And then you are left with something like that. And you might not see it, but you hopefully on the other side you will later see it. There are possible to see that there are still the roots of the hairs inside, and it's shaved. So if you touch with the manuscript like Flateyjarbók, and again it's the same with the other Icelandic manuscript, and especially if you do it with the gloves, textile glove, you can feel you're touching the hairs of 2 days shaved or something like that. Anyway, so this is what you are left with, or like this. So you partly shave, partly not shave, and this is the thing. And this is how it looked like in the Flateyjarbók, in the normal light and in transmitted light. So you can see these areas are leftovers of the hairs, and they can be easily observed. And you can see here, this is the part which was shaved, and this is the part which was not shaved. And I am not sure if you can see it, but you can see even the leftovers of the hairs here. And interestingly, it's not only on the edges, you can see it even hairs coming through the illustrations, because it doesn't matter for the scribes. And these are, of course, the edges areas where perhaps the parchment maker thought it's not going to be used, but then the parchment was too small, so they have to include it. Right. The last one is one of the scraping mark made by a very specific knife, which is like a kind of opening knife, because when you finish your parchment on the frame and it dry out, it's too thick, and it's depending on the method, of course, you use. And if you would be a proper medieval parchment maker, you would be already able to target specific type of the skin for manuscript in your head, or the, like demands from the market or whatever, what kind of parchment they expect. So you can either make it thin or thick, or depending what is the purpose. And so this is so when the skin dry out, it's not finished. That's what many people think, and what is wrong. All this process I was describing so far has nothing to do with the parchment making. Here start the art of parchment making. And that means the shaving of the skins, on and on, pouncing them down, so you reach the right thickness, and you are able to produce exactly the demanded product. So I just want to say again that this is some of the experiment to show how these things were made, what the traces are left on the surface of skin, so we can better understand what we see in manuscripts, and most importantly, which are rather specific for different types of parchment makers or scriptoria, since they use the different tools, since they have you can almost recognize whether the parchment maker was left-handed or right-handed. I mean, this is only one. It would be much more complicated. It was not purpose to talk about this here. So I would end up with my idea about the suggestion how the flyleaf could look like, and of the Flateyjarbók. And I would like to thank you very much. Right. Maybe I should go back.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much, Jiři.
Okay.
You've already made us very excited about what will be announced in Copenhagen in April about the DNA.
Well, it's all in Manchester.
It's all in Manchester, yeah. Do you have some questions for Jiři as to the parchment? Yes.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I have a question about the pelvic bones. How much? I mean, this was a sort of two-part question. There's obviously some sort of stretching involved. How regular is that stretching, and how much can you account for that in sort of calculating back to the actual size of the animal that it came from, or is that even possible?
Right. Well, I mean, yes. Well, of course there is the stretching, but there is also the shrinkage. And so, you know, honestly, it very much depends on the part of the skin. And you have much larger stretching on the belly area, where the skin is thinner and weaker, and the structure of the collagen fibers is not so strong. And but at the butt, so-called, which is the best part, it's rather consistent. That's the speaking about the nature of the skin. From the point of parchment making, I have found out that indeed, specifically these, let's say, stubble areas, they don't really stretch so much. But they do stretch, of course. But the other thing is, all of them stretch. So you can say you are more or less consistent with the stretching. So if you measure it in one manuscript, you can sort of be more or less sure that the other one was also stretched. And if it wasn't stretched, then it would be transparent and you would see it. You know, I have to say all this business is about the holistic approach. You have to combine like a small mosaic stones all together, and when you have experienced this and have a certain statistic evaluation, you can sort of move on some other things. So that's something what I would say is more or less secure. However, much bigger problem is with the sizes of the animals. I haven't mentioned this, but I've been renting the Icelandic cowboys in the north, and I was trying to measure the live calves. And it was an incredible struggle. You can imagine me with the meter, and I was measuring the spine and pelvis and everything. Well, it doesn't went very well, although I have some interesting data, and no cowboy was hurt. We caused a bit of psychic problem to some of the cows. But you see, then I went to with my measurement to the farmer, and he take his book of births and say, okay, so this one was born in May on this date, and it was slightly bigger than the other ones. And this one, despite the fact it was born too early, and so on. So you see, suddenly you find out that you should forget about all your measurement because, well, you shouldn't, but 2 centimeters doesn't matter. That's my 2-3 centimeters can be the difference because sex of the animal, male bigger, smaller than the females, etc. The size of the animals, etc. But still, the measurement of the pelvis, it's like a basic information. So I can honestly tell you the most of the manuscript of this size, well, even if it's smaller, but you have the pelvis there by randomly preserved, it range from, let's say, 8 centimeters to 12 or even 14. And that gives you the basic idea about the size of the animal. And of course, the smaller one might be stillborn. And the other one, when I mentioned that you can't do the parchment from animal old several weeks, it's actually not completely true. You can do it, but it's not like economical. Because you know, the skin is like this, and you have to work a lot, and also the fibers are more loose when you finish, and the space is much more open. So I was much more talking about the optimal result. But still you can see some information about the size of them. Sorry, I'm too long, maybe.
There's another question here.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I'm fascinated by the spine being horizontally or vertically. Can you give us any idea what the ratios between the portfolio and Flateyjarbók?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I said it's the work in progress, so I haven't done the complete evaluation. But if I was looking in my notes when I was preparing for this talk, I have found out it might be like 1 to 6, maybe 1 to 5. So most horizontal, some vertical, but some of them diagonal. Yeah. Now, do you know what is the reason why they are diagonal? No, can I borrow this paper? So if you have a skin and then you have the legs, many people think that making the choir is just folding it. No, because here you have missing part, here you have another missing part. So what you need to do, you have to sort of find the right angle so you get most of the parchment, which sometimes causes that the spine is positioned diagonally. So it's much more trying to find the best part of the skin.
Well, we definitely have to revisit the question of how many calves it took to produce Flateyjarbók. That's all we have time for questions. Thank you so much, Jiři.
It was a pleasure.
We're going to move through to the surface of the parchment, to the colors, and Lea Pokorny is going to talk about the world of colors in Flateyjarbók.
Flateyjarbók is in many ways an exceptional product of medieval Icelandic manuscript culture, as we've heard, and in some aspects not so special, apparently. But it is special, amongst others, because of the preface written by one of the scribes on folio 1 verso. Here, and this is just a repetition of what Svanhildur has already said, Magnús Þórhallsson does not only specify that Jón Hákonarson is the owner of the book, but he also reveals who was responsible for the production. And I'll read in translation. Priest Jón Þórðarson has written about Eiríkur Viðferðla and both Ólafs sagas, but priest Magnús Þórhallsson has written down from there and what was written before and illuminated all the book. Undoubtedly, Flateyjarbók is known for its rich illumination. 1,415 illuminated initials can be found in the manuscript's part that was produced by Jón and Magnús. The style is described as featuring, and I quote, rigid poses, big emphatic hands, pad-like bulges of hair, broad rectangular faces, and sometimes blank eyes. The illuminations have been studied by art historians such as Lena Lippe, whom I just quoted now, or Guðbjörg Kristjánsdóttir, but also, and maybe in most detail, by Thomas Dubois, and I will get back to Thomas several times during my talk. In August 2021, Maurizio Aceto and Angelo Agostino carried out pigment analysis on the colors used in the illuminations of Flateyjarbók. Using X-ray fluorescence and fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, pigments were identified. Both techniques are point-based, meaning that only specific segments of initials are analyzed at a time. X-ray fluorescence is a technique, and here I quote because I'm not going to presume that I can explain this better than a proper scientist, based on the emission of characteristic X-rays by an atom after it has been irradiated by a primary broadband X-ray source. The emitted X-rays are specific for each chemical element, which can therefore be identified largely unequivocally, end quote. Since these secondary X-rays emit a relatively low energy, these measurements are performed in a reflectance mode, meaning that the X-ray source and the detector capturing the secondary X-rays are positioned on the same side of the object. Fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy is a state-of-the-art tool for identifying pigments and dyestuffs. It is relatively simple, and here I quote again: a source of light, a spectrometer, and two fiber optics, one to deliver the light on the object and the other to collect the light reflected. A reflectance spectrum shows for each wavelength the ratio between the intensity of the reflected light and the intensity of the incided light. End quote. About 130 sample points were taken from 28 folios throughout Flateyjarbók. Flateyjarbók's arguably most impressive decorations are three initials that are not only historiated, but also feature bas de page illuminations, so illuminations in the lower margins of the pages. In the following, I will discuss these three initials and the pigments that were used for painting them. Most of you might recognize this page and this illumination on folio 5 verso that marks the beginning of Ólafs saga Tryggvasonar. As Thomas Dubois discusses, Ólaf's portrayal is both stately and active at the same time. He's sitting on a throne while he's drinking, and he's accompanied by a page and a canine figure, which Dubois suspects to be Ólaf's loyal dog, Vege. The initial itself is an H, not an O, as you might expect. This H actually refers to Haraldur Háfagri, with whom this version of Ólafs saga Tryggvasonar begins. The bas de page tells scenes from Haraldur's life, depicting who Dubois believes to be Haraldur as a hoofed beast, a known symbolism for harems and lasciviousness during the 14th century. Furthermore, we see a man dressed in a harlequin, which could be Haraldur's great-grandson, Eyvindur Skallabitlir, who is known for his poetic compositions. And finally, a squatting woman looking up, perhaps a depiction of Bergljót, one of Haraldur's daughters, whose name can be found in close proximity to the image, or a reference to the final line of this page, which talks about the marriages of Haraldur's daughters. 5 pigments were identified in this illumination. The little canine companion sitting next to, or standing next to King Ólafur is painted mostly in red ochre. Ochres are earth colors that are widely available, cheap, and easy to prepare. To obtain an earth color, one must simply dig up earth, mix it with water, stir or shake it so that the dirt separates from the earth, and the earth will then sink to the bottom of your little vessel. This sand that remains can be dried, powdered up, added to a binder, and used. Red ochre can either be mined directly or be obtained by burning yellow ochre. Common mining places for red ochre were, for example, in Egypt or Malta, but red ochre can also be found in England and even locally here in Iceland. Another inorganic pigment that was used here is to be found in the H initial. Here, orpiment was used. Orpiment is an arsenic yellow pigment that was comparably dangerous to use, because when it's used in close proximity to lead or copper-based pigments, the results are highly toxic. Natural orpiment deposits are found in Hungary, Macedonia, and Asia Minor, and cost and availability of orpiment fluctuated throughout the Middle Ages. The background of this initial is painted in verdigris. Verdigris is an acetate of copper, so actually here we have orpiment right next to an acetate of copper, which might not have been too healthy for Magnus. And it typically has a bluish or green appearance. You might know verdigris from the Statue of Liberty, for example, as a very known example of this process. It is very reactive, which means that it often burns through the writing support. And verdigris is made by hanging copper plates into a vinegar solution and heating this. The green layer that forms is then scraped off, powdered down, added to a binder, and there you have your pigment. For the page's frock, vermilion was used. Vermilion is also known as cinnabar, and it is mined as a rock, for example in Spain or China. The rock contains mercury, which needs to be cooked out together with sulfur. This happens in pottery vessels, in which the vermilion starts to set itself on the walls. It is then scraped off and powdered down. Vermilion is extremely common in the 14th century and was the only pigment for which egg yolk was used as a binder. It can also, of course, be bound to the more common egg glare or gum arabicum. Finally, this initial also contains an organic pigment. Organic pigments stem from plants or animals and are relatively pH sensitive, and they can be used to modify and shade colors, but also standing alone. They tend to fade from light pollution, which is why they're less stable. Here, the shoes of the king were painted in indigo, a color obtained from plants grown in Asia or Europe. By the 12th century, indigo was imported to Europe from Baghdad. The European version of indigo, woad, the yellow plant you can see here, was cultivated in England, France, Lombardy, and other places. And it is presumed that these places were likely a source for the color in Western manuscripts by the 14th century. Indigo may appear in shades of blue, violet, and gray. Oh, and I should also maybe say it wasn't the flowers that was used for the pigment, it was the leaves. In case you were wondering how that adds up to a blue color. Finally, let's move on to the next initial. The second major initial can be found on folio 9 verso. This A initial shows Ástríður giving birth to Ólafur Tryggvason, a moment that Dubois describes as connotating the humble, vulnerable, and unpromising start of a career which will prove momentous. De Badepage adds a strong hagiographic note to this nativity scene, displaying a unicorn, commonly identified with Jesus or the line of David, charging at a red beast, maybe denoting the devil. Next to the unicorn stands a naked man holding a spear and a horn, and this might be an adaptation of the Gabriel hunt complex, which was very popular throughout 14th century Scandinavia. Although the archangel might here have been changed for the naked David. Finally, a confused-looking soldier references the end of the text of this page, where soldiers are sent out to look for mother and child. Some of the pigments, such as cinnabar, vermilion, red ochre, verdigris, and orpiment, can be found here again. A new pigment that was not identified in the prior initial is vivianite. It was here found in the soldier's helmet and breastplate. Vivianite is a phosphate mineral and a blue earth pigment. It was also referred to as blue ochre by the School of Cologne in the 13th and 14th centuries. The per se colorless mineral oxidizes very easily, changing its color into a deep blue or bluish green. Vivianite, used in decorations and paintings, is known from Germany, Sweden, Norway, and the British Isles. Potential mining places include Bavaria, modern-day Kosovo and Russia, and Spain, and vivianite might be found as crystals, masses, or concretions, which is what we can see here. The last initial I would like to discuss is the beginning of the second Ólafs saga, Ólafs saga Helga. One last time, a major initial is accompanied by Padubas illuminations, and the large þátt initial shows the death of Saint Ólafur. 4 men are surrounding him, piercing his body with axes and spears. Ólafur's sword, Bæsingur, is lying next to him on the ground, and the acquiring of this very sort is told in the chapter which starts at the end of the page, indicated by the dark red þátt initial. In this scene, Ólafur receives the sword from his mother Ásta. The lower margin shows him using the sword twice, once on a mermaid creature who attempts to murder him and his men, and once on a wild boar. We again find the known pigments vermilion, red ochre, verdigris, orpiment, and again vivianite is used for the metal objects. But we find yet again a new pigment, which is azurite, here used in the background. Azurite became more and more common in Western European manuscripts from the mid-1200s onwards because of the patchy ultramarine trade. It is a hydrated copper carbonate which was mined in Germany, Bohemia, Hungary, and France. It became the prevalent blue in northern French manuscripts by the 11th century onwards, but was rare in England before the 12th century. By the 13th and 14th century, the use of azurite was increasing everywhere. Finally, there is the question of what color the boar's hinder leg is. This is very specific, but here the analysis was actually inconclusive. It might be that this color is a mix of two, on indigo on the one hand, and an unidentified yellow colorant on the other. This unidentified yellow colorant could potentially be locally sourced plant-based yellow, but this needs further analysis to get a reliable result. Overall, 9 colors and pigments were identified, as well as black ink containing iron for the writing of the main text. 2 different reds, 2 different yellows, different blues and greens were used to decorate this manuscript. When we step away from point-based analysis and consider visual analysis, so analysis with the naked eye, the following can be said about the parts written by Magnus and Jón. Of 1,415 initial spaces, all but 12 were filled in, which is an overwhelming 99.99% of the manuscript. These 12 initial spaces occurred towards the end of the 14th century part of the manuscript. From leaf 186 verso, initial 4, you can actually see the illumination stop on this page, until folio 187 verso. Furthermore, of the 1,415 initials, only 62 initials do not feature pen flourishing. These unflourished initials usually appear in clusters, meaning that there will be 2 or more pages where flourishing is missing. The color that is used the least, arguably used the least in this manuscript is yellow. Yellow is present in 8 initial bodies and was used 13 times for the decoration of initials. While dark blue is also rare in the sole use for the bodies of the initials, it is used extensively in the flourishing. On the other hand, bright red is the predominant color of the manuscript, being both used the most for initials and the pen flourishing. The 4 colors that shape the typical smaller initials that you can see here, 3 lines in height, and feature pen flourishing, are bright red, dark red, light blue, and green. The alternation of these colors is strictly speaking not regular. You can see here, while they all appear, they don't follow. Color 1 is always bright red, color 2 is always dark red, and so forth and so on. For the pen flourishing, there is even less alternation. Bright red and dark red are predominant, but dark and light blue also often occur and may stand alone. There are also instances where green is used as sole flourishing color. However, green typically finds use in the flourishing together with at least one other color. Magnus Þórhallsson had a variety of pigments at his disposal, and that could have come from all over Europe. Thanks to the Flateyjar annál in the back of the manuscript, we can deduct that the book was written between 1387 and 1394. There are no letters of trade or other recordings that mention pigments or dyestuffs from this period or from the Middle Ages overall, and thus it is impossible to assess where the pigments in question originated with any certainty. It is also, unfortunately, not possible to reconstruct how the pigments arrived in Iceland. whether they were powdered down or came here preserved in pieces of dyed cloth. Most of the imported goods at this time would have traveled through Norway, Iceland's most important trading partner in the 13th and 14th century. When Norway took control over Iceland in the 1260s, trade got more and more regulated by the crown, until a slow decline began in the 1370s and 80s. By the first decade of the 15th century, Norwegian ships stopped sailing to Iceland altogether because of the dominance of the English fleet, and the so-called Enska öldin, the English Age, began. It is, of course, tempting to assume that most pigment sources are located somewhere in Europe rather than the Far or Middle East. However, for now, it remains unknown how far Flateyjarbók's world of color extended. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lea. Could you transport the pigments by dyeing cloths and then kind of getting the pigment out of it again?
Apparently, yes, that is what Cheryl at least taught us in her course, and Vasarė probably knows more than I do.
I can say that they were called clothlets, and they were just an easy way to carry dye stuffs around, and you would just add moisture to take away the color.
Okay, so they were called clothlets. Clothlets.
Mostly for dye stuffs.
Okay. Haraldur, question.
Thank you so much, Lea. Fascinating stuff. So what did they use as a binder for these colors? Do we know that? I mean, that must have been something durable. And maybe a second question, would you be willing to speculate as to why these 12 spots were left blank? I mean, were they supposed to be somehow different from the other initials? I mean, why?
So for your first question, which binder they used, as far as I know, we haven't gotten any results from analysis. Could we expect that from any further analysis being done on Flateyjarbók?
Potentially with Raman.
Potentially with Raman, yeah. Right, so the most common binders were egg glare, which is basically egg white, and gamma arabicum, and I think we can expect that to be having been used here as well. But again, based on literature, like historical sources, there's unfortunately no indication. And as to speculating why these particular leaves were left empty, as far as I know, the next part of the manuscript. So then there comes a 15th century part, and then we go back to the 14th century where the Flateyjar begins. So this would have presumably been the end of a section. So maybe he just thought I'd work on that. Yeah.
Thank you, that was so interesting. So you said that the hind leg was possibly a mixture of two colours. I was wondering if mixing colours was something that was commonly done, and if not, if there was a reason for that.
Yeah, so mixing colors, especially, like I said, using organic pigments to alternate other pigments was definitely something that was done. There are examples, for example, from saffron juice being used to alternate colors. So I think we could expect that here, but this might also be there might be some other reason behind that. But yeah, they were used to in mix and layering on top of each other. Yeah.
Wonderful. We have room for one more question. Yes, there's one here.
Hi, Thank you, Lea, for this talk. And you mentioned that Violonite is used for metal objects, so I'm just wondering whether there is any conventions regarding which pigment is specifically used for which kind of object?
Not to my knowledge. So here it was identified in metal objects, the helmet, the breastplate, the sword, which is why I said this at this point. I don't know if there was any general tradition for any certain pigments being used for anything. Pigments could appear very differently depending on the binder, depending on the pH of the writing surface, and also just how they faded over time. So I wouldn't know. I know that certain colors had a certain connotation. So for example, in some European cultures in the Middle Ages, yellow would have a negative connotation over time, while blue would have a more royal connotation. But these are always geographically and culturally influenced, and those are more colors than they are pigment-based. Yeah, hope that answers your question.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We now move into the sphere of economics. Einhver nú innkoman, stendur sagt á nútíma íslensku þegar að fólk hneykslast á dýru dóti. Hvað skildu nú öll þessi ósköp hafa kostað? Við erum búin að heyra jafnvel svolítið sjaldgæf litarefni og svo það spurningin fjölda kálfa og allt þetta. Daði Már Kristófersson, hagfræðingur, ætlar að, held ég að, spá svolítið í þessa hluti í erindi sínu sem heitir Flateyjarbók sem menningarfjárfesting.
Þakka þér fyrir, Svanhildur. Ég verð nú að viðurkenna að ég hafði kannski að því örlitlar áhyggjur að koma hérna og tala við ykkur á þessum merkilega tíma. Áhyggjur mínar hafa vaxið mjög verulega eftir að hafa heyrt erindin hér í dag vegna þess að mér finnst ég allnokkur boðflenna í þessu samkvæmi með sjónarmið sem eru því sem næst fyrirlitleg eftir öll erindin sem hafa verið hér á undan. Ég tók eftir því að það hvorki tjara né fiður hér fyrir utan, ég vonaði sýni með skilning. En sem örlítinn bakgrunn þá ég alinn upp í Reykholti í Borgarfirði, þar sem Snorri nokkur Sturluson bjó, og með fullri virðingu fyrir leikfélaginu í Reykholtsdalnum, þá verð ég nú að segja að sú menningarsköpun sem var þar á tímum Snorra var allnokkru umfangsmeiri, heldur en það sem ég upplifði á miklu mun ríkumannlegri tímum þar sem enginn svalt, og ég verð að viðurkenna að ég velti fyrir mér hvað eiginlega var til þess að þetta var mögulegt á tímum þar sem að öllu þrengra var í búi. Þannig að áður en að þið dæmið mig að þá vil ég biðja ykkur að hlusta mig til enda vegna þess að það þrátt fyrir allt punktur með þessu öllu saman. En ég sem sagt fulltrúi hinna döpru vísinda hér í dag, og hinn döpru vísindi, þau nálgast hlutina oft nokkuð öðruvísi en aðrir. Hér listaverk sem ég hygg að margir kannist við, og því hvort þeir telja það merkilegt eða ekki. Ég ekki að hugsa virði þess, enda væri það, held ég, utan míns ramma, heldur einungis mat á því sem fjárfestingu. Og hvernig lítur það nú annars út? Jú, það málningu, það þarf svolítið að strega, það þarf einhverja spýtur, það þarf vinnumálara, og þar með fjárfestingin upptalin. Og eðlilega að þá lítur náttúrulega hryllilega út í ykkar huga þegar að sömu nálgun beitt við Flateyjarbók. Það að segja, það þarf 113 kálfskinn sem þarf að gera bókfell úr. Það þarf blek og ýmislegt fleira, og ég vil fyrirfram biðja bæði Ketill og Lea afsökunar á því að þeirra þáttur í þessum útreikningum vanreifaður nokkuð vegna þess að það eins og Lea kom inn á dálítið erfitt að giska á hvaðan þetta kom og hvað það kostaði. Svo ég setti einhverja tölu bara til þess að hafa einhverja tölu, en hún ekki mjög vel undirbyggð og við Lea getum kannski bara sest niður og eftir og rætt aðeins hvernig ætti að gera þetta. Þetta sem sagt 113 kálfskinn, kostnaður við vinnslu 226 síðna bókfells, laun 2 sérfræðinga í 2 mannár, það aðeins á reiki, hversu, semst það hefur komið þegar fram í dag, hversu langan tíma tók að skrifa bókina, en það ekki víst að menn hafi verið að vinna allan tíman og ég hef séð ágiskanir miklu styttri tíma. Ég reikna með að þessi sérfræðingar hafi verið svona heldur meira virði, heldur en almennt vinnuafl, en annað ekki, blek og annað. Ég er búinn að vara ykkur við og biðja bæði Lea og Ketill afsökunar. Þar eru hlutirnir mjög vanreifaðir. En síðan þarf að setja þetta í samhengi við það samfélag sem var uppi á þessum tíma, eða var á þessum tíma, og það alls ekkert einfalt. Við vitum ekkert óskaplega mikið það. Þannig að nálgunin sem ég nota að svona ganga út frá ákveðnum forsendum fjölda vinnandi handa á þessum tíma og að lítið annað hafi skapað verðmæti heldur en vinnandi hendur og nota það til þess að byggja upp einhvers konar hugmyndum landsframleiðslu sem samt mjög takmörkuð. Nú, þá að æfingunni. Þið eru tilbúin. Við höfum fengið mjög vandaðan fyrirlestur kálfskinnin og vinnslu þeirra. Ég er búinn að fara yfir þetta allt saman og ég er búinn að læra heilmikið sem ég ekki vissi. En heimildin sem ég styðst við þarna, ég vil segja það strax og ég er ekki með því að losa mig undan neinni ábyrgð. Þetta fólk allt saklaust, en þeir sem hafa hjálpað mér við að finna heimildir í þessu eru Helgi Þorláksson, Guðmundur Jónsson og Svanhildur. Og heimildir sem við höfum, heimildir verð, og verð virðast það að verið svona þokkalega stöðu á þessu tímabili. Þannig að kálfskinnið kostaði samkvæmt búalögum 6 álnir eða 3 álnir fyrir hvora síðu, eins og ég búinn að fara yfir með okkur. Síðan ég búinn að segja okkur frá því að aðferðirnar sem voru sennilega notaðar til þess að vinna þessi skinn á Íslandi voru ekki þær sömu og voru notaðar annar staðar. En við eigum engar heimildir hvað þessi vinna kostaði hér, svo ég gef mér að það hafi verið svipaður hlutfallslegu kostnaður og var við vinnslu sambærilegra skinna annar staðar. Og þetta heimild sem að Svanhildur benti mér á. Það eru til reikningar frá klaustri á Bretlandi, frá svona svipuðum tíma, ekki alveg þeim sama. Þar sem að kemur bæði fram hvað skinnin kostuðu sem þeir keyptu, 6 penny, og síðan hvað verðið var á afurðunum sem þeir framleiddu í 4 gæðaflokkum, og ég miða við að skinnin í Flateyjarbók hafi verið í gæðaflokki 2, en til að gæta allrar sanngirni, að þá reikna ég út líka hvað það hefði kostað ef að skinnin hefðu verið að lægri gæðaflokki, en ég ímynda mér að hér hafi verið vanda nokkuð til, enda eins og Lea hefur komið hér inn á, litirnir sóttir allan heim. Þannig að gæðaflokkur 2 næst hæsti gæðaflokkur, og þið sjáið að út frá upplýsingunum verðið á skinnunum sem þetta klaustur keypti og síðan það sem það seldi af unnu bókfelli, þá hafi þetta hlutfallslega verð verið 4, þar að segja að verðið hækkaði 4-falt við það að vinna það, eftir gæðaflokkum frá 2,7 upp í 5. Þannig að ég reikna þá út að verðið á bókfelli hafi verið 12 álnir á síðu, einhvers staðar á bilinu 8 til 15, miðað við þessar forsendur sem við þó vitum að hljóta vera rangar vegna þess að við vitum að ekki notuð sama aðferð við að vinna skinnin hér, eins og í Bretlandi, eins og Jiři kom inn á hérna áðan. Hvað með síðan landsframleiðslu? Já, hér ég aftur að gefa mér það að eiginlega eina sem skapaði verðmæti á Íslandi á þessum tíma hafi verið vinnuafl. Sára lítil eiginleg fjárfesting, auðvitað var hún einhver, en við eigum upplýsingar verðmæti vinnu í ákvæðisvinnu, 4 álnir á dag, þetta eru búalögum að viðbættum 2 álnum fyrir fæði, sem ég gera ráð fyrir að sé þjónusta sem einhver annar var að selja með vinnu sinni, þannig að hún bætist ekki við landsframleiðslu. Og síðan þurfum við einhver ágiskunum fjölda Íslendinga, við vitum heldur ekki hvað þeir voru margir, þannig að þetta eru hrikalega miklar ágiskanir hérna. En ég gef mér að þeir hafa verið 45.000, eitthvað voru þeir fleiri en þeir urðu fæstir, sumir hafa haldið fram miklu hærri tölum og það í sjálfu sér hægt að endurtaka þessa útreikninga fyrir það. Samsetning þjóðarinnar var allt önnur en hún í dag. Aldurssamsetningin var miklu píramídalíkari heldur en hún í dag, þar að segja að það voru miklu fleiri börn miðað við fullorðna í þessu samfélagi. Þannig að miðað við þessa forsendur og miðað við verði sem greitt var fyrir vinnu kvenna annars vegar og kalla hins vegar, og þá reikna ég með að vinnandi, þetta jafngildi 21.000 ársverki. Ok? Og þá það framleiðslukostnaður Flateyjarbókar. 6.000 álnir. Einhvers staðar á bilinu 4.000 til 9.000 miðað við breytilega forsendur bæði stærð hagkerfisins og laun fyrir vinnu. Skinnin, þar eigum við þrátt fyrir allt tölu, 678 álnir, vinnsla bókfells, sem sagt umfram kostnaðurinn, miðað við fyrrgreinda forsendur framleiðslukostnaði í Bretlandi, 2.034 álnir, einhvers staðar á bilinu 1130 til 2.712 miðað við ólíka gæðaflokka af skinni, og við erum þarna aftur að gera ráð fyrir, að ég að gera ráð fyrir því að þetta hefur svona frekar vönduð skinn. Ég veit ekki hvort að ég ef hann skilur getur staðfest það eða þau. Blek og annað, þetta bara tala. Ég veit ekkert hvað ég á að setja þarna. Við gætum reynt að setjast niður og bæta töluna, en þetta örugglega hóflega metið miðað við hvað þurft að sækja þessi aðföng víða. Það að segja 9.012 álnir. Einhvers staðar á bilinu 6.008 til 12.690 álnir. Það jafngildir 75 kúgildum eða 18.024 gildum fiskum. Og svo ætla ég að reyna að búa til eitthvað úr þessum mælieiningum. Álnirnar, ég velti fyrir mér að fara í Álnabæ og ég fékk raunar ágætar upplýsingar það hvað áln var mikið af vaðmáli, en ákvað að það væri óvarlegt. Hins vegar til opinber gögn verð á kúm og skreið sem eru þessi gildu fiskar. Þannig að ég nota það. Þetta samsvarar líka miðað við þessar forsendur 0,43% af vergri landsframleiðslu þessa tíma, og svona miðað við ólíka forsendur einhvers staðar á bilinu 0,3 til þá að vera 0 þarna 0,46% af vergri landsframleiðslu. Ok. Nú þarf að setja þetta í eitthvað samhengi. Hvað þýðir þetta? Áln fyrir mér þýðir ekki neitt. Hvað myndi þetta þýða ef við byggjum til eitthvað jafngildi í dag sem að þýddi eitthvað? Og við gætum auðvitað bara sagt, já, við vitum hvað þetta jafngildi mörgum kúm og við vitum hvað kýr kosta, þá getum við reiknað út hvað það væri í dag. Fyrir mér það mjög sérkennilegu mælikvarði, vegna þess að það á engan hátt víst að samsett fyrirbæri listaverk eins og Flateyjarbók fylgi sömu lögmálum og vörur eins og kýr eru þrátt fyrir allt, eða skreið fylgir. Þannig að þetta nú sennilega mat sem að mjög óvarlegt og raunar lýsir alls ekki því afreki sem það hefur verið að framleiða bókina við allt önnur skilyrði með miklu þrengri efnahag. Þannig að þó ég ætla að sýna ykkur þær tölur, að þá ég svona frekar efins þær. Við gætum nýtt okkur það að þetta var vinnuaflsfrekt verkefni, dýrt. Það að segja, jafnvel þó að ég telji skinnin þarna sem bara einhverja einingavöru, að þá verðaukningin frá óunnu kálfskinni upp í bókfell kannski fyrst og fremst vinnuafl sem þarf, eins og ég lýsti hérna áðan, til þess að breyta einni vöru yfir í aðra. Og að sama skapi heilmikil vinnsla í kringum blekið sem að búið að lýsa hérna. Þannig að við getum notað það, við getum miðað einhvern veginn við vinnuaflið, og spurningin þá á ég að miða við, og ég get líka gert það, miða við jafn stórt hagkerfi og var þá, eða ég get miða við hagkerfið eins og í dag. Og síðan get ég að síðustu reynt að meta þetta út frá sem fjárfestingu heils samfélags í listsköpun. og þá notast ég annars vegar við mælikvarða sem ég datt nú bara til hugar núna þegar ég var að búa til erindið, ég hef nú ekki sýnt áður, sem að segja, já, Ísland var fátækt. Hvað fátækt? Já, fátækt til dæmis Afríka sunnan Sahara. Við segjum Ísland á þessum árum var svona fátækt eins og Afríka sunnan Sahara. Hvers konar fjárfesting hefði þetta verið fyrir þannig samfélag og hvað myndi hún þýða, hvert væri virði hennar í dag ef ég uppfæri hana miðað við bara einfaldlega vöxt íslenska hagkerfisins frá þessum tíma eða ég get einfaldlega bara miðað við stærð hagkerfisins í dag. Og ég skrifa þarna upp eins og sjáið og þetta svona pínu mantra í mínum fræðum sko, spyr hagfræðing einhverja útreikninga þá spyr hann þig, viltu stóra eða litla tölu? Af því þið muni sjá að ég mun gefa ykkur svoleiðis valkosti, raunar held ég að það veri haft eftir Harry Truman að hann vildi gjarnan hitta einhentan hagfræðinga, one-handed economist, af því þau sögðu alltaf, well, on one hand it could be like this, but on the other hand, sem dálítið vandamálið í þessu. Það eru rosalega margir matskendir þættir á bakvið þessa útreikninga. Hér eru þá niðurstöðurnar, ef við berum miðum við bara, þetta voru bara kýr og ég fór bara í bændablaðið og fann auglýsingar fyrir kvígur sem voru til sölu, 180.000 kall stykkið, þetta voru svona marga kýr, 18,8 milljónir. Ef ég miða við opinberar útflutningstölur á skreið, hún bara flutt út til Nígeríu núna, ég passaði á að miða bara við þorskskreið, að þá fæ ég 18,8 ef ég nota kýrnar, ég fæ 19,6 ef ég nota skreiðina, það var það bil umfangið á verkefninu svona byggt á þessum forsendum. Ég tel þetta mat í sjálfu sér svona áhugavert en ekki segja okkur neitt. Af því að lýsir raunverulega ekki fjárfestingunni eins og hún hefði verið þá, heldur eins og hún væri í dag með við forsendur sem eru gjörbreyttar. Við getum miðað þetta við vinnuafl og þarna miða ég við tvær forsendur þar, annars vegar sama íbúafjölda og hins vegar sama fjölda vinnandi handa og fæ þá á bilinu 130 til 170 milljónir og þið sjáu þarna efri og neðri mörk sem eru þá þetta vik sem við töluðum áðan og þetta segir okkur þá eitthvað hvers konar umfang hefur þetta verið sem bara menningarverkefni. Ef við ætluðum að ráðast í eitthvað í dag, svona hvað væri kannski sambærilegt í vinnuumfangi. Ef við hugsum hins vegar þetta fyrst og fremst sem einhvers konar afrek í samfélagi fátæktar, þá færi ég rök fyrir því og það sem að pirraði mig, eða ekki pirraði, vakti áhuga minn sem barn í Reykholti var forgangsröðun þessara fátæku samfélaga á listsköpun, á menningarstarfsemi. Og þá finnst mér eiginlega miklu skynsamlegra að miða við einfallega bara hversu stórt hlutfall af landsframleiðslu var ráðstafað í og við erum að tala um eina af þessum bókum sem hafa varðveist af einhverju umfangi sem var skrifað á þessum tíma. Segir eitthvað um forgangsröðun samfélagsins í þágu menningar. Og þá fáum við tölur einhvers staðar á bilinu 1000 til 1500 milljónir. Vil ég stóra eða litla tölu? Ég fullkomlega meðvitaður að þetta það sem þið eru að hugsa. Algjörlega. En ég bið ykkur samt að velta þessu fyrir ykkur. Hvað skapaði skilyrðin, og ég ætla að reyna að koma með þessar spurningar hérna eftir, hvað skapaði skilyrðin fyrir þessa menningarstarfsemi sem ég síðan taka fram að virðist hafa að mestu lagst af einhverju ástæðu. Væri hægt, og það allt önnur spurning, gæti mín fræðigrein sagt eitthvað til virði, svona eins og við hugsum virði, því áttu ykkur á því ég tala þetta sem fjárfestingu, það allt annar hlutur, en gætu við meti virði? Já, ég kenni alveg þær aðferðir hérna við háskólann. Þar erum við þá að tala einhvers konar jákvætt framlag til samfélagsins. Við erum ekki að velta fyrir okkur hvað kostaði hluturinn, heldur hvað skapar hann af velferð. Þær eru hins vegar dýrar og ónákvæmar og hefði raunar aldrei komið til greina að beita þeim hér, en ef að áhugi væri á því, þá væri það mögulegt. En aftur að þessu sem aðal mótivasjóni hjá mér og reynar ástæðan fyrir því að ég sagði já við Kristján Kristjánsson þegar hann hringdi í mig og spurði var ég til í að búa til svona einhverja útreikninga. Hvað skapaði tækifærin í íslenska hagkerfinu á þessum tíma sem leyfði umfangsmikla listsköpun? En síðan hvarf. Hvaða stoðir voru það sem hurfu? Og bara svona til þess að samfæra ykkur það að ég raunverulega hef mikinn áhuga á þessu, þá ég núna að vinna að rannsóknarverkefni með kollega mínum Hreiðari Valtýssyni við Háskólann á Akureyri fiskveiðar Íslendinga á 17., 18. og 19. öld og við erum að mæla fiskgengd og hvort það eru sveiflur í fiskgengd. Og þetta það sem við fáum út. Fyrir þá sem kannski ekki alveg vanir að skoða svona línurit, þá sýnir sem sagt ásinn sem gengur inn í myndina, ártölin frá 1600 til 1800 og þetta hlaupandi úrtak og það sem við erum að mæla eru sveiflur í fiskgengd. Og það sem við sjáum þarna eru einhvers konar hryggir, mynstur sem að komu mér rosalega óvart þegar ég fór að skoða þessi gögn, sem eru með tíðnina það bil 20 ár, það bil 30 ár og það bil 60 ár. Af hverju ég að sýna ykkur þessa mynd á fyrirlestrum Flateyjarbók? Jú, það vegna þess að íslenska samfélagið lifði gegnum aldirnar rosalega þétt við náttúruna og óverulega breytingar í henni höfðu veruleg áhrif á allt samfélagið. Kannski þannig að, og ég held að það hefur verið meira mæli á Íslandi en nokkuð staðar annar staðar vegna þess á endanum voru raunverulega bara 2 stoðir undir íslenska hagkerfinu. Það voru einhverjar fiskveiðar og það var landbúnaður og hvort tveggja algjörlega háð náttúrulegum skilyrðum. Og nú ná þessi gögn auðvitað ekki aftur á það tímabil þar sem Flateyjarbók var skrifuð, en var svona mikið betra að búa hérna þá? Er þetta veðurfarstengt eða var þetta verslun með einhverja hluti? Það hafa verið kenningar og þið áttu ykkur því ég hagfræðingur hérna og ekki sagnfræðingur, þannig ég bara ramsa upp því sem ég hef heyrt. Vangaveltur einhvers konar grænlandsverslun eða verslun með rostungstennur eða eitthvað slíkt. Eitthvað var þarna sem skapaði svigrúmið. Það getur líka verið, og einhver geti staðið upp og sagt það, já, kannski var þetta bara forgangsröðun samfélagsins, kannski var bara einhver andi menningar og listsköpunar sem sveifi við vötnunum sem gerði að verkum að fátækt bændasamfélag forgangsraði þessum verkefnum. En fyrir mér eru þetta geysilega áhugaverðar spurningar. Takk fyrir.
Kærlega fyrir staði. Þetta var mjög hressandi í lokin. Ekki einhver sem vill leggja það orð í berg? Haukur, gjörðu svo vel.
Takk kærlega, mér finnst það mjög skemmtilegt. En titillinn var Flateyjarbók sem fjárfesting, þannig að ég hélt alltaf að kemja í lokin hvað hefði maður nú grætt á þessu, maður hefði framleitt á sínum tíma og alltaf að selja þetta núna eftir að Vasarė og þau eru búin að gera við.
Er einhver tilbúin að kaupa hana?
Já, það er ekkert mál að selja hana.
Hvað heldur þið fengið fyrir hana?
Það fengust 36.000 pund fyrir Skarðsbók Póstulasafna þegar hún var seld á uppboði í 1960 eitthvað, það er svona síðasta dæmi. Það verður alltaf hægt að reikna hvað sú bók var góð fjárfesting.
Ég reiknaði ekki með að þið væri
fyrir streymið á bara.
Ég reiknaði bara ekki með ég reiknaði ekki með að þið væri svona viðsýn að ég gæti komið hérna og sagt að við ættum þetta að selja hana og fjárfesta í, ég veit ekki, þið vitið, vegakerfinu eða eitthvað. Þannig að, nei, auðvitað væri hægt að taka það nálgun. Vandamálið er það að þetta eru ekki einsleitar vörur. Það er að segja, og vill nú þannig til að ég er sérfræðingur í uppboðum, sem þýðir að það er eiginlega ekki hægt að draga þá ályktun af sölu á einu málverki hvað annað málverk á eftir að kosta, því að hvert sig hefur einhvern veginn alveg sérstakt virði. Þannig að ég myndi, ef þú bæðir mig að meta hana til fjár, þá myndi ég í stórkostlegum vandræðum með það.
Haraldur.
Já, þakka kærlega fyrir, þetta var mjög áhugavert. En ég var að veltaði fyrir mér sko hvort að það geta hugsað sér Flateyjarbók sem söluvöru á þeim tíma þegar hún var framleidd. Við vitum að það voru mjög glæsilegar bækur sem að voru til dæmis eins og lögbækur, ég meina handritað Jónsbók sem að voru ekki, sko, það fyrir alltaf eftir hvað skilgreiningum maður notar á orðinu list, en náttúrulega Jónsbók, þetta var í rauninni tæki. Og eins var til dæmis að kirkjan, það voru rit þar sem að voru notuð, afar glæsileg handrit. Sko, klaustrin til dæmis sem að framleiddu Jónsbók hafðu sjálf kannski ekkert ýkja mikið not fyrir Jónsbók og alls ekki fyrir mörg handrit á Jónsbók, þannig að það mjög trúlegt að klaustrin hafi framleitt Jónsbókarhandrit sem söluvöru. Þannig að það var spurningar þetta að skjóta á hvað kostaði þegar maður lappaði inn í klaustur og segði þeir getið framleitt fyrir mig hérna handrit.
Hún kostaði 9.012 álnir. Ég held þetta rosalega góður punktur og það alveg ljóst að á sínum tíma, það ekki rétt munið á mér, hún skrifuð og það einhvern tímann plan það að gefa hana sem mögulega. Sem sagt, hversu rausnarleg var þessi gjöf? Þetta var mjög rausnarleg gjöf miðað við stærðina á hagkerfinu.
Já, þakka þér fyrir Daði, Torfi Dúlnius. Já, ég með tvær spurningar eiginlega, sko. Þetta svona tvíhent spurning en ekki einhent. Hvað ef að þetta svona 5, ekki hálft prómill af vergri landsframleiðslu sem að fór í þetta til að búa til Flateyjarbók sem að margir telja hafi einmitt verið búin til að vera gjöf til Noregskonungs og að sú gjöf hafi aldrei verið gefin. En hvað það á með við verga framleiðslu samfélags í dag?
1,5 milljarður.
Já, hvað myndi maður vera að gefa mikið? Og svo í öðru lagi, og það kannski meira það sem ég að velta fyrir mér út frá síðustu hugleiðingum þínum samfélagi, sko eðli samfélagsins, að miðaldarsamfélag mjög mikið samfélag gjafa. Fólk að gefa, fólk gefur hvert öðru, fólk gefur höfðingjum, fólk gefur til kirkna og til klaustra og þess aftar. Þannig að mjög stór hluti af landframleiðslunni endar þar, sko heldur en að frekar, og síður í vösum auðmanna eins og í samfélagi, nútímasamfélagi. Einhver angi innan þinna fræða sem að metur umfang gjafaskipta í samfélaginu með við verslunar?
Það voru hérna 2 ísraelskir hagfræðingar sem að skrifa einu sinni grein sem heitir Allra tapið vegna jólana og þar sem þeir báru saman virði gjafana, keyptar út úr búð og það sem að þiggjendurnir hefðu verið tilbúnir að greiða fyrir gjafirnar sem að reyndist vera miklu lægri tala. Þess vegna kallað allra tapið. Dead weight loss of Christmas, ef þið viljið deprimerandi lesningu það get ég mælt með. Sko, ég held að þetta sé alveg 100% rétt hjá þér að það svolítið erfitt að leggja mat á samfélagið og það líka það sem ég var að benda á áðan að kannski ég bara með rangar hugmyndir að þarna hafi verið einhver verulegur slaki, kannski var það bara þannig að þetta var önnur menning og svo hvarf hún og það kom einhver önnur menning í staðinn. Ég held samt að sko rými til að gefa gjafir í samfélagi þar sem þú varla hefur að éta takmarkað. Einhver varð að sleppa því að fara út á tún og skrifa bók í staðinn. Það varð að vera rými til þess að hleypa honum í það. Að í staðinn fyrir að fá bara korn fyrir fiskinn að kaupa fyrir það blek, sem ég er búin að gleyma nöfnunum og öllu þessum blekum sem voru nefnd hérna áðan, en þið vitið litarefni. Það það sem ég er að tala þegar ég er að tala slaka hagkerfinu, einhverja umframgetu sem að hægt var að ráðstafa með þessum hætti án þess að það þýddi endilega brauð á diskinn. En var þetta menning eða var þetta bara þið vitið grundvöllurinn í hagkerfinu eða var þetta blanda af hvort tveggja, þið vitið, engin veit og síst af öllu ég.
Já, takk fyrir mjög skemmtilegan fyrirlestur. Og athyglisvert, ég með svona beina spurning og svo athugasemdir og spurningin í þessu Afrikulandi sem telur þeir ennþá í kúgjöldum, hvað var í hætt fyrir þetta land, fólk í þessu landi að kaupa fyrir eins margar kúgjöldi og Flateyjarbók fyrir?
Rosalega mikið.
Já, eða sem sagt bíl, Rolls Royce eða búa hús eða byggja mörg hús eða hvað?
Það var hægt að byggja mörg hús. Rolls Royce svolítið erfiður vegna þess að hann ekki framleiddur í landinu og þyrfti að flytja hann inn og þá bara kostar hann eitthvað ákveðið, sko, það eiginlega ekki, en mörg hús.
Já, og þá vil ég bara taka upp þar sem hann Haraldur var að nefna með, sem sagt, allar bækurnar sem eru búnar til á Íslandi á miðöldum og hvað það væri gott að hafa svona eitthvað hagfræðingar fara í þetta. Því að allar kirkjur áttu meira eða minna af bókum og við heyrum oft að prestur átti bók sem hann gaf kirkjunni. Já. Og ég var nú að hugsa einmitt í þessu tilfelli, það eru 2 prestar sem skrifa bókina. Já. Og þeir eru ekki að fá peninga fyrir sína verk. Þeir eru prestar sem eru með stöðu. Þetta eins og fastráðin kennari í háskólanum. Og þeir geta notað sína auka tíma til að skrifa hvað þeir vilja. Og jú, það vilja þeir og kálskinn kostar og litur kostar. En það ekki alveg hægt að rekna þetta út eins og svona.
En sko, að því þú sagðir háskólakennari, ertu semst að segja það að ef ég væri úti að moka snjó, þá væri ég að framleiða verðmæti, en að því ég hérna inni að tala, þá ég ekki að því. Að því að ég lít nefnilega ekki á það þannig, sko, ef að samfélagið er tilbúið að hafa prestinn í vinnu, þá þýðir að það er tilbúið að fórna vinnuafli hans í að sinna preststörfunum. Þar með virði.
Eða frekar þannig að hann, eftir að hann búinn að
en hefði hann þá ekki verið að gera eitthvað annað?
Þá hefur hann svo mikinn tíma aftur til að skrifa.
Ég get alveg, þetta er alveg argument sem ég tel algjörlega valið. Af hverju hættu prestarnir að skrifa þá eftir þennan tíma, af því að þeir hljóta hafa haft jafnmikinn tíma síðar í Íslandssögunni til þess að gera eitthvað sem þeim datt til hugar. Og þá bara hverfur þessi, en sjáu þið, ég nefnilega ekki sammála ykkur eitt atriði í þessu, og það er að ef að var hægt að reka hérna stóra prestastétt sem var sáralítið annað að gera heldur en bara eitthvað svona sem datt til hugar, þá hlýtur að hafa verið slaki. Eða hvað? Og mér getur sagt síðaskiptin, ok, en hefði þá ekki, sko, af hverju hvarf slakin við síðaskiptin? Ég skil það ekki. Já, þetta hafi bara verið, Íslendingar hafi verið leigulegar. Það gæti alveg verið kenning. Ég meina, það er alveg til algjörlega greiningar sem gætu stutt það. Gott samtal.
Ég held að það sé komið hana mjög gott svona upplegg fyrir líflegar umræður hér á eftir þegar við fáum léttara veitingar. Ef það eru ekki fleiri spurningar á þetta. En áður en við streymum hérna fram, þá ætlar Guðrún Nordal, forstöðumaður Árnastofnunar, koma hér og slá botnin í dagskrána.
Svo er þetta taktu niður flæðuna með slerðunum, það er svo dómar.
Já, við ætlum ekki að hafa hana, já. Nei, það er flott. Viltu hafa hana? Það er ákveðið, sko. Já, við getum sett það. Tekja það. Viltu vista þetta, Daði? Við lendum í vandræðum, við höfum þetta.
Við cancelurum bara. Við cancelurum. Hvernig sker ég það? Ég ætla ekki að hafa þetta cancel. Ég ætla að cancela sjónina þarna leiðilegt. Svona. Kæri gestir, ég verð að segja það að það hefur verið ævintýri líkast að fylgjast með viðgerð Flateyjarbókar og nú hafið þið fengið svona nasasjón af því í dag og ég viðurkenni líka að hjartað hefur slegið örlítið hraðar í hvert skipti sem við þurfum að taka ákvörðun næstu skref því að við höfum verið að taka ákvörðun framtíðarinnar en við vissum líka að við urðum að forða henni frá skemmdum og við vissum að allt sem við gerðum væri afturkræft og það er auðvitað það sem skiptir máli. Myndirnar af konungsbók Eddukvæða og Flateyjarbók þegar það voru bornar á land á síðasta vetrardag fyrir rúmum 50 árum er greift í minni okkar, Flateyjarbók í 2 bindum og konungsbók í litla brotinu Og við hugsuðum lengi, eins og hefum líka komið fram hér í dag, hvort við ættum að halda henni áfram í tvennu lagi. En ég verð að segja það, hún rifjaði upp stundina áðan, hún Vasarė, hún algjörlega ógleymanleg stundin sumarið 2018 þegar hún kallaði okkar niður í forvörsluherbergið þar sem hún hafði lagt saman hlutana tvo og við sáum saumana gangi í gegnum bókina og augljóst og hún hafi verið saumuð sem ein heild í upphafi. Og það var opinberun og ég held að það kannski fundi fyrir því hérna áðan þegar þið sáuð myndina. Hún var komin alla leið heim. Hún faðmaði, þeir faðmuðust þessi tveir hlutar. Ég þakka ykkur öllum sem hafa leitt vinnuna á stofnuninni frá upphafi. Viðgerðin á sér langa sögu eins og rakið hefur verið í dag. Við söknum að sjá ekki Sigur hér og Herstein sem hefðu lögðu svo mikið að mörkum. Og síðan hefur mest mættu þetta á Vasarė Rastonis sem talaði hér áðan með digra aðstoð Jiřis og þakkaði fyrir allan þinn fráleik og stuðning. Svanhildar Óskarsdóttur sem hefur leitt hér samkomuna hefur verið umsjónarmaður verkefnisins frá því að viðgerðin hófst fyrir alvöru og vil ég þakka henni fyrir örugga og fumlausa stjórn. Hún svona róaði líka hjartasláttinn og þeim báðum fyrir að efna til þessa þings í dag og öðrum sem á aðstofa við skipulagningu þess. Viðgerðin hefði ekki verið unnin nema fyrir sérstakan styrk ríkisstjórnar Íslands. Það var líka peninga til að laga hana eins og að búa hana til og það kostar að gera við bækur en það kostar enn meira að gera það ekki. Og það ekki neitt hallað og horfi á Benedikt þegar minnst á einstakann áhuga Benedikts Jóhannessonar, þáverandi fjármálaráðherra á verkefninu árið 2017 og var það eitt síðasta verk ríkisstjórnarinnar sem satt það ár að styrkja okkur og fyrir það skal þakkað. Vinir Árnastofnunar tóku líka verkefni upp á sína arma og í dag minnist ég Ástríður Sigurðar Svavarssonar, fyrsta formanns vina Árnastofnunar sem var heitur stuðningsmaður og þegar ég segi heitur þá þeir sem þekktu hann vissu að hann var mjög heitur stuðningsmaður okkar og leitaði styrkja í verkefnið. Blessuð sé minning hans. Hann stóð líka fyrir að kvikmynda í upphafi sem að þætti í viðgerðinni sem við eigum. Að endingu þakka ég ykkur öllum sem hafa talað hér í dag fyrir innblásin erindi og þú varst nú síðastu hér að koma okkur upp á annan stall. Við erum vön að velta vöngum yfir þessum stórkostlegu bók, þá meira inntækinu, einstökum textum og heildarsamhengi þeirra innan spjalda sögunar eða bókarinnar, en það geymir stórbrotnar frásagnir af norskum kóngum sem soga til sín sögur af fólki allt í kringum Atlantshafið eins og Íslendingasögur. En í handritinu eru líka nýmæli. Þar til dæmis fyrsta ríman varðveitt Ólafs Ríma Haraldssonar og þar með var opnað fyrir flæði rímnanna sem ríktu hér næstu 5 aldirnar. Svo í bókinni erum við ekki bara að horfa tilbaka heldur áfram fram á veginn. En í dag höfum við velt fyrir okkur gripnum, listaverkinu, handverkinu, þessu fólki sem við þekkjum ekki, sem bjó til bækurnar, þá sem nú. Og eins og Daði var að sýna okkur, var það ekki áhlaupaverk að skrifa slíka bók og auðvitað ekki að færa nema auðugustu manna að stofna til slíkra bókagerðar, að hafa eitthvað afgangs til að í þennan lúxus að búa til bækur. En hvað má það segja öll hin handritin sem voru skrifað á sama tíma, sem eru varðveitt hér í handritasöfnuninni hjá okkur en líka erlendis í öðrum söfnum og svo ég tala nú ekki öll handrit sem eru glötuð. Af hverju voru þau búin til, hvernig höfðu við efna á þessu? Var þetta annað mat á gæðum en auðvitað urðu við að hafa fé og vinnuafl til að vinna þetta. Hvað segir, eins og þú spurðir, hvað segir bókagerðin okkur efnahagslíf og mikilvægi menningar á fyrri öldum? Kæri gestir, ég þakka okkur fyrir að komuna í dag þegar ég fyllt salinn og glatt okkur mjög með því og líka þið sem hafi fylgst með okkur í streyminu. Eini gesturinn sem fjarverandi auðvitað Flateyjarbók sjálf. Hún auðvitað með okkur í andanum og við hlökkum til að sýna ykkur hana þegar við opnum sýningu í nýja húsinu og verðið velkomin þangað. Og svo í lokin þið komið auðvitað hér fram og njótið veitinga með okkur. Takk fyrir komin í dag.